Welcome to Canada, the land of maple syrup and unreasonably polite people. A place where losing your mitten on a sidewalk will often result in someone placing it neatly on a fence post so its owner can find it again. A country that takes friendliness so seriously that strangers will hold doors for you even if you're 40 feet away and clearly not speed walking. And if you don't speed walk, they'll apologize for rushing you. All right, Lynn, it's your turn today. Hope you'll enjoy this one, darling. But first up, let me apologize in advance for any mispronounced names. Damn, I really tried, so please don't take it personally. Newfoundland, 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 Newfoundland. Not confusing at all. Thank you very much. Although I grew up saying Newfoundland, I found some legit Canadian saying Newfoundland is the correct one, so if it's not, you'll suffer a lot throughout the entire video. But I guess we Brits deserve that considering our gift of Worcester sauce. Consider us even, and yes, my Newfie pup already forgave me. Let's start with the maple leaf. Why a leaf? Why not a majestic animal or a mountain or something that doesn't flutter off trees every autumn? The maple leaf became a symbol because, for a very long time, maple trees were everywhere people were trying to live. Early French settlers noticed them. Indigenous peoples had long understood their importance. By the 1800s, especially in what is now Quebec and Ontario, the maple leaf was already being used in songs, badges, emblems, and regimental symbols. It represented the land, resilient, rooted, and seasonal. It ended up on military insignia, provincial coats of arms, and then finally, in 1965, took center stage on the new Canadian flag. So when you see that red maple leaf, it isn't just a logo. It's the simplified, graphic design version of a long relationship between people and trees, a symbol of the forests that shaped settlements, the seasonal cycles that shaped life, and the idea that a country could be defined not by a crown or a weapon, but by something living and growing. And speaking of maple trees, we have to talk about maple syrup. Because yes, Canadians really are that attached. The syrup story starts long before Europeans arrived. Indigenous peoples in northeastern North America were the first to tap maple trees, collect the sap, and boil it down into something sweet and precious. There are different stories about how it began, but they all share the same core. People noticed that in the late winter the trees bled a clear liquid, and if you boiled it, it turned into sweetness. That's not just food. In northern climates, that is late winter emotional support. European settlers learned these techniques, then industrialized them in the way Europeans tend to do with anything edible. Campfires and carved wooden troughs gradually gave way to iron kettles, sugar shacks, and steel evaporators. Today, most of the world's maple syrup comes from Canada, especially Quebec, where maple season is practically its own festival. Families and friends head out to sugar shacks, eat indecent amounts of food, pour maple syrup on snow to make taffy, and pretend it's all very normal and not just a sophisticated excuse to drink caramelized tree juice in heroic quantities. Maple syrup became part of Canadian identity because it is one of the few foods that is both deeply local and globally iconic. It comes from the trees that have always been here, collected in the cold season and turned into something intensely comforting. It tastes like survival and celebration at the same time. Now let's talk the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Yes, the Mounties. Not just a tourism poster in a scarlet coat, but a real police force that somehow manages to look formal even while riding horses through forests. And honestly, that uniform is a work of art. Somewhere out there, a designer looked at a bright red tunic, wide-brimmed hat, leather boots, and said, yes, that's the look. Canadians will fight crime, but they will do it stylishly. Once upon a time in the 1870s, the Canadian government decided it needed a police force to operate across the vast Western Territories. So it created the Northwest Mounted Police, the the predecessor to the RCMP. They needed an image, something that commanded respect, looked official, and reassured settlers and distant politicians that order was present on the prairies. So what did they do? They copied British military style. The red serge tunic was inspired by British Army uniforms. Bright scarlet wasn't exactly practical for blending into forests, but it was highly visible, which had its uses. It signaled authority. You could see it from far away. It also made officers easier to spot if, say, they inconveniently fell off a horse or wandered off in a blizzard. The high collar and stiff posture radiated imperial seriousness. The wide-brimmed hat, that classic Mountie look, came later. The Stetson-style felt hat was practical on the prairies, good for sun, rain, making someone look like a cross between a British officer and a Western cowboy. So the modern Mountie uniform is basically the fashion love child of Britain and the frontier. Today, the RCMP doesn't ride horses everywhere or wear red serge to chase speeders, but the dress uniform still appears at ceremonies, parades, and tourist-heavy zones. It's part tradition, part performance, part branding. It says, here is Canada's historical idea of law and order, tidied up and camera-ready. Then there's hockey, the unofficial religion. Canadians play it, watch it, debate it, cry over it, tattoo it, and teach it to children as soon as they can stand upright. You cannot fully understand this country until you've watched people wake up at 5 in the morning to drive to a freezing arena so their 8-year-old can skate in circles while adults shout encouragement from metal bleachers that appear to be made of refrigerated steel. You might be asking, why is Canada so good at a sport that looks like chaos on ice with sticks? First, climate. For a big chunk of the country, winter is not a season, it's a lifestyle. Ponds freeze, lakes freeze, backyards freeze, streets freeze. If you can pour water on it, eventually it becomes a rink. For generations, kids learned to skate almost as soon as they learned to walk. Skates and sticks became standard winter equipment, like mittens and long underwear. Second, access. You don't need much to play hockey at its most basic level. A frozen patch, a stick, something vaguely puck-shaped, and at least one other person willing to swing at it. Organized hockey, leagues, arenas, equipment, came later. But the heart of the game lives in outdoor rinks and pick-up games where you play until your toes go numb and someone's mum calls them in for dinner. Third, culture. Once the game took hold in the late 1800s, it spread fast. Montreal standardized early rules. The Stanley Cup was introduced in the 1890s. By the 1900s, hockey wasn't just a pastime, it was a passion. Communities formed teams, leagues expanded, newspapers covered games, heroes emerged. The country poured its winter energy into cheering, playing, and arguing about who should have been traded last season. Hockey became a kind of national mirror. It was fast, physical, emotional, sometimes scrappy, sometimes poetic. When Canadian teams won on the international stage, the country saw itself as capable and tough. When they lost, the mourning had roughly the same intensity as a minor national disaster. The game wrapped itself around identity so tightly that even people who don't watch hockey still understand it as a shared cultural reference point. Canada is also the only place on Earth where the phrase "it's a bit chilly" may refer to temperatures that could freeze your eyelashes together. Winters here aren't just cold, they're personality tests. They teach you resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to look someone in the eye and say, with absolute sincerity, that -20 is actually not that bad once you acclimatize. And yet, for all the frostbite-adjacent weather, Canada is also absurdly beautiful. Think northern lights swirling across the sky in colors so unreal you'll squint to check whether you accidentally turned on a filter. Think lakes so blue they look photoshopped. Think the Rockies rising like ancient stone cathedrals. Think forests that stretch farther than your sense of time, dotted with moose who wander across highways whenever it inconveniences drivers the most. Canada stretches deep into the Arctic, under the auroral oval, the zone where charged particles from the sun collide with Earth's atmosphere and create shimmering curtains of color across the night sky. For northern and indigenous communities, the aurora isn't just a pretty light show. It carries stories, meanings, and spiritual significance. For visitors, it's one of those experiences that make you go very quiet, very suddenly. The Northern Lights are part of why Canada has such a strong identity tied to the North, even though most Canadians actually live relatively close to the US border. The idea of the North looms large in the imagination, a place of mystery, danger, beauty, and resilience. A place where the land is unforgiving but the culture is deep and rich. And speaking of land, the lakes, the forests, the mountains, the sheer amount of space. Canada has an almost ridiculous number of lakes. Glaciers carved and scraped this landscape for thousands of years, leaving behind basins that filled with water after the ice retreated. The result? More lakes than any other country on Earth. Big ones, tiny ones, lakes that look like oceans, lakes that look like someone spilled a cup of water in the middle of a forest. For a long time, lakes were not just vacation spots, they were highways. Canoes traveled them, trade moved along them, settlements were built around them. Today, Canadians head to the lake like it's a single, universal place, even though there are literally millions. They swim, paddle, fish, and stare into sunsets that look like paintings. The obsession with nature is not just aesthetic, it's practical and psychological. When you live in a country this big, with seasons this dramatic, nature isn't background, it's a main character. And oh, the food. Canada has poutine, a dish that sounds bizarre to anyone who has not tasted it, and immediately addictive to anyone who has. French fries, cheese curds, gravy. It is comfort food engineered with almost scientific precision to restore joy in the depths of winter. Canada is full of contradictions. It's a country famous for politeness, yet also home to hockey fights. A land known for snowstorms, yet also home to beaches with warm sand and bright sun. A place celebrated for its peaceful reputation, yet shaped by histories that weren't peaceful at all. A country with stereotypes so soft and friendly that visitors forget it is also vast, wild, and complex. Deeply complex. Let's dive in. If you picture the land that would one day be called Canada before Europeans arrived, try not to imagine empty forests waiting for someone to show up with a flag. That fantasy was created by people who were very attached to the idea of discovery, despite already being several centuries late to the party. The truth is better, much better. For thousands of years, the land was alive with civilizations that understood the place more deeply than any outsider ever would. They built networks, stories, governments, and technologies suited to the rivers, plains, coasts, and tundra in ways that still impress even the most jaded historians. Let's start far back, long before anyone had metal tools or nation-states or arguments about taxes. Archaeologists have found evidence of human presence in the land at least 13,000 years old, possibly older if a few debated sites turn out to be legit. People had arrived after tracking animals, seasons, and opportunities across a landscape shaped by retreating glaciers. If you imagine massive ice sheets melting away to reveal valleys and forests, then picture families following herds of mammoths and caribou, you're on the right track. These early inhabitants didn't just survive. They adapted with skill, creativity, and an understanding of the environment that modern outdoor enthusiasts can only dream of. As the climate changed and the land warmed, whole cultures emerged. They didn't all share the same language, ideas, or political systems. Think of Canada not as one story, but as 100 stories playing out at the same time, each with its own heroes and challenges. Along the Pacific coast, communities like the Haida, Tlingit, and Coast Salish developed rich economies built on the ocean's abundance. Imagine cedar canoes so finely crafted they cut through waves like sports cars made of wood. Picture towering totem poles that told family histories with more style than any genealogy website. These societies built permanent villages long before Europeans were even debating how to boil potatoes properly. Moving inland, the plateau region around modern British Columbia held peoples such as the Secwepemc and Nunlakapamuks, who thrived on river fisheries and seasonal rounds of gathering. They developed pit houses insulated with earth to keep warm during winters that would send most modern folk sprinting back indoors after 3 seconds. Their seasonal movement wasn't random wandering, it was a well-organized system that balanced ecology, food security, and community life. Further north, in lands where the winters can make your eyelashes freeze, the Dean peoples mastered a subarctic lifestyle that required a kind of resilience we only see today in people who willingly run ultramarathons. They navigated immense distances with snowshoes, knowledge of stars, and cultural memory passed through stories that held entire geographies within them. Their map wasn't on paper, it was alive in language, song, and oral tradition. And then there were the Inuit, whose relationship with the Arctic stands as one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements. They built homes from snow blocks, used seal oil lamps that provided light and warmth, engineered kayaks and umiaks that could outmaneuver waves, and developed hunting methods that relied on deep understanding of animal behavior. Every single part of their environment, from ice thickness to wind patterns, was read like a textbook written by nature herself. The fact that European explorers often stumbled into the Arctic and nearly died within 10 minutes, while the Inuit had thrived there for centuries, should tell you something about who truly understood the land. Meanwhile, across the plains stretching from Manitoba through Saskatchewan and Alberta, nations like the Cree, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and Dakota developed cultures centered around bison. The bison was not just food, it was shelter, clothing, tools, glue, thread, shields, and in some ways the heartbeat of the region. Communal bison hunts required coordination and skill. The technology of the horse arrived only in the 1700s, but even before that, these societies were mobile, structured, and connected through kinship and diplomacy. Picture lodges designed to be taken down and reassembled with a speed that would shame certain modern furniture companies. These were not primitive wanderers, they were expert managers of mobility and resources. Heading east, the Great Lakes region formed a vibrant hub of culture, trade, and politics. The Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, built societies that revolved around fishing, harvesting wild rice, and maintaining trade routes across waterways that functioned as the highways of the time. Their birch bark canoes were lightweight, strong, and shockingly efficient. Europeans would later marvel at these designs, copy them, and then pretend they invented half the improvements. Near the St. Lawrence and down into the northeastern woodlands lived the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. If you imagine early democratic political systems erased the idea that Europe was miles ahead. The Haudenosaunee had a sophisticated confederate government run by chiefs chosen through matrilineal clans. Women held enormous authority. Decisions were made through consensus. This was not some vague group effort. It was a structured political alliance among nations including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and eventually Tuscarora. Their system lasted centuries and influenced political thinkers far beyond their territory. Along the Atlantic coast, the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Beothuk lived in rich maritime landscapes filled with salmon runs, shellfish beds, and forests full of game. Their seasonal rhythms moved smoothly with the land's resources. The Mi'kmaq in particular established district councils and a grand council, showing once again that Indigenous governance was neither chaotic nor simple. It was responsive, effective, and deeply tied to cultural values that emphasized respect, balance, and responsibility. Across the continent, Indigenous nations traded with one another long before European ships scattered across the Atlantic. Shell beads from the coasts moved inland. Copper tools from Lake Superior traveled thousands of kilometers. Obsidian from the Rockies found its way east. These exchanges weren't only economic. They included ideas, ceremonies, marriages, and alliances. The continent was alive with interaction and diplomacy. Territory wasn't rigidly mapped like modern borders, but understood through relationships, seasonal rites, and shared stewardship. Spirituality wasn't a separate category tucked away for the occasional ritual. It infused every part of life. The land was not an object to be claimed, but a living partner. Animals were teachers as much as food sources. Stories carried moral lessons, historical knowledge, and ecological instructions in one seamless narrative. Oral tradition wasn't just stories, despite what some early anthropologists implied. It was memory, law, science, and identity built to last. When Europeans eventually arrived, shocked that people were already here, they encountered societies that were complex, organized, and far from passive. Early contacts involved moments of curiosity, trade, conflict, alliance, and negotiation. But all of that comes later. For now, the important truth is that Indigenous nations were not waiting to be introduced to the rest of the world. They were already part of a world, one that functioned with balance, sophistication, and long-standing systems of knowledge. Picture canoes gliding across lakes at dawn. Picture smokehouses curing salmon on the Pacific coast. Picture bison herds stretching to the horizon and hunters who understood migration patterns better than most modern biologists. Picture longhouses where decisions were debated until consensus emerged. Picture Inuit families traveling over sea ice with sleds built from driftwood and bone, guided by stars and instinct. Picture children learning the stories of their people, not from textbooks but from grandparents who carried centuries of memory in their voices. These were not isolated snapshots. They were the foundations of entire worlds, worlds with rules, humor, innovation, conflict, and wisdom. Worlds that made sense of the land long before maps carved it into provinces and territories. And these worlds weren't frozen in time. They changed, adapted, expanded, and reinvented themselves constantly. New tools appeared, new political alliances formed, new trade routes flourished. Indigenous societies were dynamic, not static displays in a museum. The land itself shaped culture. The Pacific rainforests nurtured woodworking traditions that produced canoes, poles, and houses of breathtaking skill. The plains encouraged mobility and partnership. The Great Lakes inspired a water-centered lifestyle where travel, trade, and diplomacy often took place by canoe. The Arctic demanded precision, patience, and ingenuity. Every region developed its own solutions, and each solution reflected generations of accumulated knowledge. And Indigenous languages? They weren't simple either. Many used structures that could express ideas modern English struggles to capture. Some encoded relationships directly into grammar. Some described time in ways that made Western clocks look like clumsy inventions. And the oral literatures in these languages included epics, creation stories, political histories, and practical survival lessons all folded together. This chapter isn't meant to summarize every culture. That would take volumes, and even then it would barely scratch the surface. But it sets the stage for understanding that Canadian history doesn't begin with a flag or a European explorer shouting into the wind. It begins with peoples who understood the land intimately and shaped societies suited to its rhythm. When Europeans finally arrived sailing wooden ships and carrying deeply misplaced confidence, they weren't stepping into a new world. They were entering a world that had already been lived in, loved, governed, and understood for thousands of years. A world with its own stories, its own leaders, and its own sense of belonging. Canada didn't begin with colonization. It began long before in the lives and legacies of the First Peoples. And to understand any later chapter, from Vikings to Confederation to modern debates, you have to start here, with the people who knew the land first, shaped it with care, and still shape it today. If you imagine the Viking arrival in North America as a neat, organized expedition full of heroic speeches and pumpkin spice optimism, you might want to lower your expectations. The Vikings were extraordinary sailors, no question. They crossed the Atlantic in open boats at a time when most Europeans were still nervous about coastal fishing trips. But they were also human, which means their great exploration of Canada started with a mix of curiosity, bravado, and probably at least one person insisting he knew a shortcut when he absolutely did not. To understand how these seafaring Scandinavians ended up in Canada, you first have to picture their world around the late 900s. Norway, Iceland, and Greenland were home to communities of farmers, traders, adventurers, and people who thought nothing of rowing toward the unknown. From Norway, explorers pushed west to Iceland. From Iceland, they went to Greenland, and from Greenland, they stared out at the ocean and wondered what else might be out there. This is the part of Viking history where ambition and restlessness mixed into a recipe that led straight to the shores of what is now Newfoundland. One of the central figures in this story is Eric the Red, a man famous for being charismatic, fiery-tempered, and excellent at getting kicked out of places. After being exiled from Norway for, let's say, overly enthusiastic problem-solving, he moved to Iceland. Then he was exiled from Iceland, so naturally he sailed west, found Greenland, and declared it his next home. This shows you the Viking approach to life. If people tell you to leave, just keep going until the map runs out. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, grew up in this world of wide oceans and restless ambition. Leif eventually heard stories from another explorer, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course in a storm and claimed to have glimpsed a mysterious land far to the west. Bjarni never went ashore, which probably haunted him for the rest of his life, because Leif immediately decided he could do better. So around the year 1000, Leif gathered a crew, loaded a ship, and set off toward the unknown. He had no GPS, no weather app, no satellite images. What he had were strong arms, a sense of direction, and the unwavering Viking belief that if you row long enough, something interesting will happen. Leif and his crew passed through regions they later called Helluland and Markland, names that translate to things like flatstone land and forest land. While poetic in their simplicity, these names suggest the Vikings were mainly focused on the immediate landscape and not on building a thriving literary scene. After days or weeks of travel, they reached a place they named Vinland. There is still debate about what Vin meant. It might have meant wine, because they supposedly found grapes, or it might have meant pasture. Scholars continue to argue. Meanwhile, the Vikings must have looked around and thought, this is nice, let's stay a while. Where exactly Vinland was has been debated for centuries, but we now know that at least one Norse settlement existed at Lanceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. This site, rediscovered in the 1960s, gave archaeology one of its most satisfying mic drop moments. The remains of buildings, ironworking, and tools matched Norse styles perfectly. It was the kind of evidence scholars dream of. Not vague stories, not legends, but physical proof that Vikings really did reach North America 500 years before Columbus. The settlement at Lance Meadows was modest but impressive. Imagine scattered sod-walled structures tucked into the landscape, built from timber and earth. There were workshops where iron was smelted, which is remarkable given how few places in the entire continent at the time were using iron tools. Even more striking, evidence suggests the site was a base camp rather than a permanent town. It was a place where crews repaired ships, stored supplies, and prepared for explorations further south. Those explorations mattered because the Vikings were not the only people on the continent. Indigenous peoples had lived in the region for thousands of years, and they were not exactly thrilled to meet a group of tall, heavily bearded men who arrived uninvited and proceeded to set up camp like overly confident tourists. The Norse sagas describe encounters with indigenous peoples whom they called skraelings, a term that historians now view as less than flattering. Translation: the Vikings were not writing with cultural sensitivity in mind. These early meetings were cautious at best and tense at worst. At some point, trade was attempted. The sagas describe exchanges where Vikings offered cloth in return for furs. But cultural misunderstandings escalated quickly. One version of the story tells of Vikings giving out milk, not realizing that not everyone's digestive system welcomes dairy with open arms. Things went downhill fast. Add in language barriers, unfamiliar behaviors, and the Vikings' tendency to assume they could settle anywhere they wished, and you can see why peace did not last. Conflict eventually broke out, and the Vikings learned something important. Indigenous peoples of the region were skilled, organized, and entirely capable of defending their homelands. The Norse crew, far from home, outnumbered and nervously aware that they had no reinforcements coming, made a strategic decision. They packed up and went back to Greenland. This decision does not make them cowards. It makes them practically minded. The Vikings had survived storms, cold seas, and entire sagas worth of drama, but one thing they were not prepared for was establishing a permanent colony in a land already held and defended by people who knew every inch of it. In Viking logic, leaving was simply the smart move. Although the settlement at Lance Meadows was abandoned, Norse visits to North America likely continued for a while. There are hints in archaeological sites of occasional return voyages, perhaps for timber or exploration. The Greenland colonies needed wood, and North America had trees in abundance. But nothing ever developed into a lasting settlement. The Vikings were stretched thin across their world. Their Greenland communities were isolated and vulnerable. Eventually, environmental change and shifting political realities cut them off, and the window for Norse exploration closed. You may wonder why the Vikings didn't stay longer or spread further. The short answer is that logistics beat ambition. Sailing across the Atlantic was hard enough. Maintaining supply lines between Greenland and Newfoundland was even harder. Add in conflicts with indigenous peoples and the fact that Greenland was beginning to struggle with cold climate shifts, and you end up with a situation where packing up and going home made far more sense than trying to become the landlords of Vinland. Still, the Viking presence in Canada matters for more than its novelty. It proves that the Atlantic Ocean was not an impenetrable barrier. The Norse were the first Europeans to make contact with the Americas, and they did it 5 centuries before Columbus. They crossed thousands of kilometers of ocean using sunstones, stars, and sheer nerve. They brought with them iron technology, shipbuilding expertise, and a willingness to take risks most people would call reckless. And their arrival, brief as it was, became part of the broader human story of movement across continents. Indigenous oral histories from some northern communities include stories of tall visitors arriving by sea, although these accounts vary and are hard to match precisely with saga descriptions. What matters is that contact was not a one-sided tale of European discovery. It was a meeting between people with their own histories, technologies, and worldviews. The Vikings may have written their version in sagas, but indigenous peoples carried their memories in oral tradition just as deeply rooted and just as meaningful. In the centuries that followed, the Norse expeditions faded into legend. Their Greenland settlements collapsed by the 1400s. Europe lost contact with the Western world until later explorers arrived with bigger ships and far more ambitious plans. But the Viking stories remained. They were told and retold, sometimes embellished, sometimes doubted. For a long time, scholars argued over whether the sagas were historical or fanciful. Then Lanceau Meadows was discovered, and the sagas earned a victory lap. Today, the site is a UNESCO World Heritage location, and visitors can walk through reconstructed longhouses that give a sense of the Viking presence. While the settlement was short-lived, its legacy stretches across centuries. It shows that exploration is rarely linear and never simple. People sail, wander, experiment, and retreat. Sometimes they change the world. Sometimes they leave behind a fragment of a story that won't be fully understood until 1,000 years later. In the grand sweep of Canadian history, the Viking chapter is small but unforgettable. It is a testament to human curiosity, guts, and the eternal urge to see what lies beyond the horizon. It is also a reminder that contact between cultures is never just a footnote. It is a powerful moment shaped by misunderstanding, opportunity, conflict, and the unpredictable mix of personalities who happen to be standing on the shore. Imagine a Viking ship cutting through fog as Newfoundland's coastline emerges. Imagine the crew stepping onto land, breathing in the scent of pine and salt, aware that they are the first of their people to stand here. Imagine Indigenous families watching from a distance, assessing these curious strangers with their odd clothing and impossible boats. Two worlds meet, each rooted in its own history, neither quite understanding the other. They exchange, they argue, they fight, and then the moment ends. The Vikings leave behind traces, iron nails, a spindle whirl, fragments of buildings. These pieces wait patiently for a millennium until archaeologists uncover them and knit the past back together. And suddenly the world knows that the story of Canada includes not only the first peoples and later European arrivals, but also the tale of a brief Norse adventure that flickered across the Atlantic frontier and then vanished. This chapter of history does not end with triumph or conquest. It ends with the Vikings heading back across the ocean, their dreams of Vinland folded into saga and memory. It ends with Indigenous communities continuing their lives unaffected in the long term by the curious visitors. And it ends with the land itself, unchanged by the brief footsteps that touched its shores. Canada's story is full of sweeping timelines, but the Viking chapter sits quietly near the beginning, a spark of exploration and a hint of what was to come. The Norse arrived, looked around, tried a few things, got into a fight and left. Not exactly an epic empire, but absolutely unforgettable. If there is one theme that repeats itself in early European exploration, it is this. Someone sets out confidently looking for Asia, absolutely does not find Asia, and then acts surprised when they run into entire continents that have been minding their own business for thousands of years. This pattern becomes almost comical by the late 15th century, and Canada owes a chunk of its recorded history to a particularly enthusiastic participant named Giovanni Caboto, better known to England as John Cabot. Before we get to Cabot, though, picture Europe in the late 1400s. Ships were getting stronger, navigation was improving, at least by the standards of the day. Monarchs were looking for new trade routes because everyone was sick of paying high prices for spices, silk, and other good stuff arriving overland through the Middle East. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453 spooked European traders and pushed them to look for alternate paths. And thanks to Columbus landing in the Caribbean in 1492 and believing he'd reached Asia, European rulers suddenly thought the Atlantic was full of shortcuts if you just sailed bravely enough. England, feeling left out while Spain and Portugal claimed all the glory, needed a bold seafaring hero. They found one in Cabot, an Italian with a flair for adventure and a marketing strategy that would have done well in the modern startup world. Cabot convinced King Henry VII that he could cross the North Atlantic, hit Asia directly, and bring home enough spices to make everyone forget they were living in a damp island kingdom that spent most of the year waiting for the sun to reappear. Henry, always open to low-budget, high-potential schemes, gave him a ship. In 1497, Cabot set out from Bristol in a small vessel called the Matthew. Calling it a ship might be generous. By modern standards, it was barely more than a floating wooden hope. But Cabot had courage, determination, and just enough confidence to keep his crew motivated. After weeks at sea, the crew spotted land. Cabot planted a flag, declared the region part of England, and assumed he had reached somewhere near China. This is a recurring theme. Explorers had no idea where they were, but they always assumed it was Asia, never mind the details like geography or reality. Cabot had actually reached the coast of Newfoundland or possibly Labrador. The exact landing site is debated, mostly because Cabot left vague notes, and later writers filled the gaps with enthusiasm rather than evidence. But what matters is that he stepped onto North American shores almost 500 years after the Vikings had come and gone. Cabot did what many explorers did best. He claimed a place he didn't understand for people who weren't there, and then sailed home to announce his accomplishment. His voyage thrilled Henry VII because the king saw opportunity. If England could claim fishing grounds, resources, or, fingers crossed, a route to Asia, it would boost the kingdom's prestige. Cabot went back the following year with multiple ships ready to build on his discovery. But somewhere during the crossing, the expedition vanished. Some historians think the ships were lost in storms. Others think Cabot reached North America again and died there. No one knows. He simply disappeared into the cold waters of the Atlantic, leaving behind a mystery fit for any maritime historian's daydreams. Even without Cabot returning to tell dramatic stories, word about the region spread quickly in Europe. Not because of gold or spices, but because of fish. Cod, specifically. The North Atlantic's cod stocks were enormous, and European fishermen who reached the Grand Banks realized they had stumbled upon the seafood jackpot. Some historians believe Basque and Portuguese fishermen may have been quietly visiting the region even before Cabot, keeping the information secret because nothing ruins a fishing spot faster than telling everyone about it. Soon, ships from France, Spain, Portugal, and England were arriving seasonally to fish the rich waters of present-day Newfoundland. These weren't permanent settlements yet. They were temporary camps where fishermen came ashore to dry and salt their catch. But these visits marked the beginning of sustained European involvement in the region. This was the start of a long dance of contact between Europeans and indigenous peoples. When fishermen came ashore, they sometimes traded metal tools, knives, beads, and cloth for furs and food. For the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, and other Atlantic nations, these encounters were new and unpredictable. Some went relatively smoothly, others led to misunderstandings, conflict, or cautious distance. The Beothuk in particular became elusive, avoiding direct contact after early encounters proved violent or exploitative. Their history becomes one of the tragic threads in the larger story of colonization. Meanwhile, the European imagination was heating up. Rumors flew across the Atlantic about lands rich with forests, game, and possibilities. Maps grew increasingly ambitious, drawn by people who had never seen the places they were labeling. The idea of a Northwest Passage, a magical sea corridor linking Europe to Asia through the Arctic, took hold. This idea would later inspire countless doomed expeditions, but at the time it sounded like a perfectly normal dream. In the early 1500s, more explorers followed Cabot's path. Some were sponsored by France, others by England or Portugal, all of them hoping to find something that would make them famous. Giovanni da Verrazzano explored the East Coast. Jacques Cartier would later sail up the St. Lawrence, but that story belongs to another chapter. For now, the focus remains on the slow but steady shift in European thinking. Canada, though not yet called Canada, was being noticed. Trade was the gateway. Even casual exchanges with indigenous peoples opened the door for economic relationships that would deepen throughout the 16th century. Europeans wanted furs, especially beaver pelts, because fashion trends in Europe had decided that everyone needed hats made from the softest possible material. Fur hats became symbols of wealth, power, and style. This obsession would eventually reshape entire regions of North America. But in these early years, the trade was light and opportunistic. On the indigenous side, metal tools, knives, and axes were incredibly useful. Copper tools existed in North America long before Europeans arrived, but iron offered new strength and durability. Cloth, beads, and new materials entered existing cultural practices. Trade was not simply about objects. It affected relationships, political alliances, and economic systems. Indigenous nations approached trade strategically, taking advantage of European goods while maintaining their own structures and priorities. While seasonal fishing camps grew along the coast, Europeans still viewed the region more as a resource zone than a place to settle. There were no grand colonization schemes yet. European empires were just getting started, figuring out which corners of the world they wanted to claim. France was increasingly interested in exploration. England was curious but cautious. Spain focused its energy further south, where gold and silver were far easier to steal. As for Portugal, it never built large settlements in Canada, but it fished the region with gusto. And through all of this, Europeans still clung to the belief that Asia was just a bit farther west. If only they sailed a little more, pushed a little harder, they might find the mythical strait linking the Atlantic to the Pacific. This kind of optimism is inspiring on one hand and baffling on the other, given the sheer size of the Americas. But the European imagination was powerful, and when people want something badly enough, they tend to ignore evidence. The irony is that indigenous nations already had knowledge of the vastness of the continent. They knew there were mountains, plains, rivers, and entire regions stretching far beyond anything the Europeans imagined. But Europeans weren't listening. They were too busy staring west and picturing silk markets. The early 16th century brought more exploratory voyages, most of which ended in disappointment. A few ships were wrecked, others returned empty-handed. Some returned with enthusiastic tales about forests and fish, but no pathways to Asia. Yet even those modest reports were enough to build momentum. Europe was an energetic continent with kings eager to expand influence. Eventually, someone would show up not for seasonal fishing, but for long-term settlement and control. Not surprisingly, competition followed. France and England had a habit of fighting each other whenever possible. Their rivalry played out in North America as both sought influence. But in these early decades, the fighting remained in Europe, while the fishing fleets of both nations quietly set up operations along the northern coasts. These camps, rough as they were, created the first instances of Europeans spending enough time in the region to learn its rhythms. Imagine those early camps, sailors hauling massive nets, salting fish on wooden racks, swatting at mosquitoes the size of small aircraft, and peering nervously at the dense forests just beyond the shore. There were no towns, no trading posts, no colonial governments, just the ocean, the land, and the growing awareness that this place was not a side quest on the way to Asia, but something significant on its own. Some Europeans were fascinated, others were terrified, most were cold. but all understood that the North Atlantic fisheries were too valuable to ignore. By the mid-1500s, dozens of ships crossed the ocean every year, building relationships, causing conflicts, and slowly threading Europe and North America into each other's orbits. The indigenous peoples along the Atlantic coast watched all this carefully. They weren't passive observers enjoying the show. They evaluated Europeans the same way any society evaluates newcomers, based on usefulness, threat, opportunity, and behavior. Some groups forged relationships that would later shape diplomacy. Others withdrew strategically. The region became a complicated space where two worlds interacted, each with its own goals and rules. This period is often overshadowed by later, grander stories of colonization. But these first encounters matter because they set the stage for everything that followed. Europeans came not with armies, but with fishing nets. They came not to conquer, but to experiment. And in the process, they opened pathways that would soon widen into the fur trade, settlement, and eventually the geopolitical drama that defines much of Canadian history. It is tempting to imagine Cabot standing on a Newfoundland shore thinking, "I have reached Asia." He probably declared victory before he had even seen much of the coastline. But his voyage, flawed as it was, marks the beginning of Europe's long, complicated involvement with the land that would one day be called Canada. It started with a mistake. Many great stories do. This chapter ends with nothing resolved. No grand discovery of the New World, no permanent colonies yet, no clear sense of direction. Just a growing connection between continents built on fish, confusion, optimism, and the occasional shipwreck. But the momentum was building, and it wouldn't slow down. If the early European presence in Canada was a slow simmer of fishing camps and confused explorers looking for Asia, the arrival of France turns the heat up to something closer to a full rolling boil. France did not come quietly. It came with ambition, strategy, questionable optimism, and a habit of declaring ownership over places where the locals had definitely not filed any paperwork agreeing to such arrangements. But to understand how France ended up planting its flag along the St. Lawrence River, you have to start with a man named Jacques Cartier, who had a boat, a mission, and enough confidence to fill the entire Atlantic Ocean. Cartier, a French navigator from Saint-Malo, set sail in 1534 under orders from King Francis I. The king wanted gold, spices, and a route to Asia because European rulers at the time all wanted the same three things and rarely considered adjusting their wish lists. Cartier made his way across the Atlantic and reached the Gulf of St. Lawrence. From the moment he sailed into those waters, he believed he was onto something big. Whether he truly understood what he was seeing or simply liked the look of the place is up for debate, but Cartier had a talent for dramatic declarations. He explored the region, planted crosses, renamed places, and met the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, who must have wondered why this man kept pointing at everything and giving it French names like a toddler labeling objects in kindergarten. Cartier's first contact with the St. Lawrence peoples was a curious blend of diplomacy, cultural exchange, and misunderstandings. At the village of Gaspé, Cartier erected a 30-foot cross and claimed the land for France. The indigenous leader, Donnacona, watched this with what we can reasonably assume was deep suspicion. When someone plants a giant religious symbol in your territory and acts like it's completely normal, you know you're in for an interesting relationship. Cartier returned to France with two of Donnacona's sons, supposedly as guests. But the line between invited visitors and coerced captives is very thin in these early European indigenous interactions. When Cartier came back the next year, he pushed further up the St. Lawrence. He reached Stadacona, where present-day Quebec City sits, and then continued to the impressive village of Hochelaga at the site of modern Montreal. Hochelaga was large, fortified, and bustling with life. By the time Cartier stood on Mount Royal and admired the view, he felt certain he had found the gateway to Asia. Spoiler alert, he had not. After a harsh winter, strained relations with the local peoples, and a lot of ice, Cartier returned to France again. His third voyage fizzled, partly because he became more interested in finding non-existent gold than in building a lasting colony. France, meanwhile, got distracted by wars, politics, and Italy's general habit of attracting French kings into long, expensive conflicts. For decades, French involvement in North America slowed to a trickle. Then came Samuel de Champlain, who entered the story like a well-organized storm. Champlain was not just an explorer. He was a cartographer, a soldier, a writer, a diplomat, and, honestly, something of a visionary. He had a knack for imagining what could be built in a place long before others saw the potential. By the early 1600s, France was ready to make another push into North America. Champlain sailed across the Atlantic multiple times, scouting potential sites and forming alliances with indigenous nations who already dominated the land. In 1608, Champlain founded what would become Quebec City. If Cartier had flirted with the St. Lawrence Valley, Champlain was the one who moved in, unpacked his bags, and announced he was staying. He built a wooden habitation at the base of the cliffs, a humble beginning for a settlement that would eventually become the anchor of New France. But Champlain knew he could not succeed alone. From the moment he arrived, he built alliances with the Huron-Wendat, Montagnais, and Algonquin nations. These alliances were not random. Indigenous groups had long-standing enemies and political networks. Champlain stepped into this landscape and made choices that would shape decades of conflict and cooperation. The Huron-Wendat, based around the Great Lakes, were major players in the fur trade. They traded with dozens of nations across a vast region. They were not desperate for European allies, but they recognized opportunity. Champlain, in return, relied on them for survival, navigation, military support, and access to trade networks he could never have built on his own. The partnership was real, but it came with strings. France inserted itself into indigenous conflicts, most notably with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the south. This rivalry would become a cornerstone of the region's political landscape. Champlain's military involvement was immediate. In 1609, he joined his indigenous allies in battle against the Haudenosaunee near what is now Lake Champlain. Wielding an arquebus, an early firearm that was basically a metal tube with ambition, he killed several Haudenosaunee chiefs in one shot. European firearms were unfamiliar in the region, and this moment left a deep impression. The Haudenosaunee would not forget it. Their response would echo through the next century. Back in Quebec, life was precarious. Winters were brutal, supplies were limited, and disease was a constant threat. The settlement relied heavily on indigenous knowledge. Without guidance on hunting, fishing, and surviving the climate, the French would have vanished faster than you can say frostbite. Yet the population remained tiny. For decades, New France was more of a fur trading outpost than a colony. In 1627, the Company of 100 Associates was created to control trade and encourage settlement. But encourage turned out to be an optimistic word. Few French families wanted to leave comfortable towns for a rugged life across the ocean. Despite low numbers, the French built a strong presence through alliances and economic relationships. The fur trade became the lifeblood of New France. Beaver pelts, in particular, were the gold of the era. European fashion demanded beaver felt hats, and demand skyrocketed. Suddenly, the forests and waterways of the St. Lawrence Valley became part of a global economy. Indigenous trappers gathered furs, French traders transported them, ships carried them to Europe, and wealthy consumers proudly wore them while pretending they had nothing to do with large-scale environmental change happening an ocean away. As trade expanded, so did French claims. Missionaries arrived, mainly Jesuits, determined to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. They lived among communities, learned languages, and wrote detailed accounts of their experiences. These Jesuit relations, as they're known today, are valuable historical documents, but also deeply shaped by missionary perspectives. Their presence created tension. Some indigenous nations engaged with them strategically, others rejected them. Conversion was not sweeping, and the Jesuits often found themselves trying to understand cultures while simultaneously trying to change them. Meanwhile, competition intensified. The English were establishing colonies farther south. Trade routes were constantly shifting. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, armed with Dutch and later English firearms, became a powerful force in the region. The rivalry between the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat grew fiercer. In the 1640s, conflict escalated into what historians call the Beaver Wars. Warfare, disease, and political strains took a heavy toll on indigenous communities, and the Huron-Wendat Confederacy eventually collapsed under combined pressure. Through it all, the French population remained astonishingly small. In 1663, after decades of slow growth, New France was home to only a few thousand settlers. France finally decided that if this colony was going to succeed, it needed more than traders and priests. So King Louis XIV made New France a royal colony, taking direct control and sending the famous filles du roi, or king's daughters, young women, recruited to help increase the population. It worked. Slowly. Daily life in New France blended European routines with local realities. Settlers farmed along the St. Lawrence on long riverfront plots called seigneuries, which created communities stretched out in narrow rectangles. The French learned how to build houses suited to the climate, navigate rivers, and negotiate alliances. But despite these adaptations, New France remained fragile. Winters were merciless, crops failed, supply ships were delayed, yet the colony endured, shaped by resilience, partnership, and necessity. By the late 17th century, French explorers pushed deeper into the continent. Figures like Radisson, de Groseilliers, Marquette, and La Salle traveled through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi River, and far into the interior. They mapped routes, established forts, and expanded French influence. This expansion created enormous tension with the English and later British colonies, setting the stage for clashes that would eventually decide the fate of North America. But in this chapter, the focus stays on the early foundations, the arrival of Cartier, the vision of Champlain, the alliances with indigenous peoples, the fur trade, the missionary efforts, and the small but determined settlements that clung to the St. Lawrence Valley. France's presence in North America began as a gamble, grew through cooperation and conflict, and became a distinct cultural world that still survives today in the form of Quebec's identity, language, and institutions. France did not arrive to find an empty wilderness. It arrived in a land already alive with nations, histories, and power structures. And for a time, New France existed as a unique meeting place where cultures collided, blended, misunderstood each other, relied on each other, and shaped each other's destinies. This story isn't simple, and it certainly isn't peaceful, but it marks the moment when Canada's identity began to take on layers. Indigenous foundations remained strong. French presence added new complexity, and soon, of course, the British would arrive and decide they wanted everything too, because history is nothing if not a series of people wanting more land than they can responsibly handle. If you want to understand the next phase of Canada's history, forget politics for a moment and focus on one animal that unintentionally shaped half a continent: the beaver. Small, industrious, and adorable in a "please stop chewing my house" kind of way, the beaver became the unlikely engine behind economic systems, political alliances, and wars that spanned generations. European demand for beaver felt hats was so intense that it rewired the map of North America. The fact that an entire global trade system was powered by rodents is one of history's finer ironies. By the early 1600s, Europe had decided that felt hats made from beaver fur were the height of style. If you were wealthy, powerful, or simply wanted to look like you had your life together, you needed a beaver hat. This meant Europeans needed furs. And since European beavers had already been overhunted, traders looked west. The rivers, forests, and marshlands of North America were full of beavers, and indigenous nations who had long hunted them now found themselves sitting on the continent's most coveted export. The fur trade was not one simple exchange. It was a web of relationships, negotiations, and constant motion. Indigenous nations trapped and prepared furs. French traders transported them. European merchants sold them. Fashion-conscious Europeans wore them proudly while having no idea that the hat on their head had traveled thousands of kilometers in a birch-bark canoe. Nothing about this story is simple, and it certainly wasn't peaceful. The Huron-Wendat Confederacy was central to the fur economy early on. Their location near the Great Lakes put them in perfect position to act as intermediaries. They traded with dozens of nations to the north and west, gathering furs through established networks. They also had long-standing alliances with the French. These connections gave them trade power, military allies, and initially a strategic advantage over their rivals. One of those rivals was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. Their homeland stretched south of the St. Lawrence River and into what is now New York State. The Haudenosaunee were politically sophisticated, fiercely organized, and highly skilled at warfare. Their Confederate government, built around hereditary clan leadership and consensus-based decision-making, was one of the most impressive political systems in North America. But disease struck first. European illnesses swept through indigenous communities long before direct contact. Waves of smallpox, influenza, and measles moved inland with devastating speed. Populations dropped sharply. The Haudenosaunee were hit hard, so were the Huron-Wendat, the Algonquin nations, and nearly every community connected through trade. Entire villages were emptied. Elders who held generational knowledge were lost. For many nations, this was a trauma deeper than any war. Amid this upheaval, the Haudenosaunee adapted by centralizing power and reorganizing militarily. They began acquiring firearms from Dutch traders to the south. With guns, strategic planning, and a need to rebuild strength, they launched a series of campaigns historians call the Beaver Wars. These conflicts weren't about beavers in a literal sense. They were about trade routes, influence, survival, and control of the continental economy. The Haudenosaunee targeted the Huron-Wendat first. The Wendat, weakened by disease and stretched thin by trade demands, suddenly found themselves facing an opponent armed with new weapons and unrelenting resolve. The French attempted to support their Wendat allies, but France's population in North America was still tiny. Firearms were limited. The French could not match the power of the Dutch-supplied Haudenosaunee. In the 1640s, the conflict reached its peak. Haudenosaunee warriors attacked Wendat villages with devastating effect. Missionaries like Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant, who had lived among the Wendat, were killed. These events later became dramatic centerpieces in Jesuit writings, though they often left out indigenous perspectives, focusing instead on martyr stories. The Wendat Confederacy fractured. Survivors fled, scattering across the Great Lakes region and beyond. The collapse of the Wendat trade system reshaped the fur economy. Groups like the Odawa, Ojibwe, Shawnee, and Miami expanded their influence. The Haudenosaunee continued pushing west, engaging in conflicts with other nations, capturing territory, and adopting captives into their communities. This practice, known as mourning war and adoption, was deeply rooted in their response to population loss. It was cultural survival, not senseless violence. As the trade shifted, French traders began working with new partners. The Anishinaabe nations, especially around the western Great Lakes, emerged as vital players. Canoes crossed lakes in vast numbers, carrying furs to French outposts like Montreal. Indigenous trade networks, which had existed long before Europeans arrived, adapted quickly. Routes changed, new alliances formed, and the trade continued, always moving, shifting, alive. Meanwhile, the French were busy establishing their own trading system. They relied on coureurs des bois, the infamous French-Canadian adventurers who were equal parts traders, explorers, and men who absolutely refused to follow instructions. These free-roaming fur traders paddled deep into indigenous territories, forming partnerships, marrying into communities, learning languages, and building a Franco-Indigenous culture that would later give rise to the Métis people. The French authorities were not thrilled about this. They wanted regulated trade, predictable profits, and citizens who didn't vanish into the wilderness for 2 years chasing better beaver pelts. But the coureurs des bois ignored rules with enthusiasm. They were skilled canoeists, daring travelers, and sometimes the only link between French settlements and distant trade networks. Without them, New France's economy would have collapsed. With them, it became wild, decentralized, and sometimes politically messy. Trade competition did not come only from indigenous nations. Europeans were also fighting for control. The Dutch supported the Haudenosaunee. The English eyed the region with growing interest. France wanted to secure the St. Lawrence and the interior. No one agreed on boundaries because maps were vague, ambition was high, and every empire believed that drawing imaginary lines on paper meant something to people who had never been consulted. By the late 1600s, the English replaced the Dutch in New York and continued supplying firearms to the Haudenosaunee. The balance of power shifted again. Meanwhile, the French built forts to the west, including Fort Frontenac and later Fort Michilimackinac. These outposts became vital hubs where goods flowed in, furs flowed out, and alliances were negotiated with the same seriousness usually reserved for royal marriages. The Haudenosaunee continued their campaigns, expanding their influence into the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region. Their confederacy was strong but permanently shaped by the trauma of disease. At the same time, French allied indigenous nations worked together to resist Haudenosaunee expansion. Battles occurred from the St. Lawrence to the western Great Lakes. Canoes carried warriors, diplomats, traders, and news across vast distances. All of this movement required mastery of waterways. Canoes were the highways of the era. Fast, lightweight, and perfectly suited to the land, they allowed thousands of kilometers of travel that Europeans could never have achieved alone. Indigenous technologies, especially birchbark canoe construction and portage knowledge, made the fur trade possible. Without them, New France would have been stuck trading within a small radius of Quebec and calling that a victory. By the 1680s, France and the Haudenosaunee were in open war. French troops, settlers, and indigenous allies clashed with Haudenosaunee warriors in brutal raids. The French governor, Denonville, made disastrously bad decisions, including attacking a group of Haudenosaunee leaders under the pretense of peace negotiations. His actions fueled retaliation, raised tensions, and demonstrated the ongoing inability of European officials to understand or respect indigenous diplomacy. The turning point came with the arrival of Governor Frontenac, a man with enough ego, stubbornness, and sheer theatricality to thrive in the chaos. Frontenac repaired alliances with indigenous nations, strengthened defenses, and launched counterattacks. His leadership helped stabilize the region, though at high cost. Wars continued, but eventually by the early 1700s, both the Haudenosaunee and the French recognized that endless conflict was unsustainable. In 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal was signed. This diplomatic achievement brought together dozens of indigenous nations and representatives of New France. It ended decades of intense warfare and opened a new period of trade and cooperation. The Great Peace did not erase rivalries or restore lost populations, but it created breathing room. It allowed the fur trade to flourish again and shifted the political landscape toward diplomacy rather than constant battle. Canoes once more filled the rivers, carrying traders, families, pelts, and news. Indigenous nations regained stability in some areas, though disease and economic pressures continued to reshape communities. In the background, another major shift was happening: the rise of a new trading empire. In 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company was established under an English royal charter. This company would soon become one of the most formidable corporate forces in North American history. With posts along Hudson Bay, backed by European capital and operating on a business model that encouraged indigenous trappers to bring furs to them rather than the other way around, the HBC introduced competition that would fundamentally challenge the French. But that transformation deserves its own chapter. Here, in the heart of the 1600s, the story is about movement, canoes slicing across lakes, alliances forming and breaking, nations fighting for survival, and European powers learning that North America was not a place they could simply claim without consequence. Every trade route had a history, every partnership had a cost, and every beaver pelt carried with it the weight of relationships that were far more complex than European buyers ever understood. The Beaver Wars, despite their dramatic name, were not just about warfare. They were about cultural resilience, economic strategy, and the ways indigenous nations navigated unprecedented challenges. They were about a continent adapting to new forces while holding on to deep-rooted traditions. And they were about the early foundations of Canada taking shape through conflict, cooperation, trade, and the unstoppable current of change moving through every river. By the early 1700s, New France had survived harsh winters, rival empires, shifting alliances, and a fur trade that relied more on birchbark canoes than on any plane the French crown had actually approved. It had also survived the endless habit Europe had of treating North America like a chessboard without asking the players already on the ground what they thought. But even with its resilience, New France was standing on the edge of a much larger storm. And that storm, as usual, was sparked by Europe doing what Europe did best: fighting with itself. France and Britain had never been good at minding their own business. They bickered over trade, colonies, religion, and just about anything two countries can argue about. If history had referees, they would have permanently assigned one to these two nations. The tension spilled across the Atlantic, and soon the fate of the St. Lawrence Valley wasn't going to be shaped by canoe brigades or fur traders alone. It was going to be shaped by empires that saw North America as a prize. Let's back up a step. After the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, New France had a brief moment to breathe. The constant warfare with the Haudenosaunee eased, the fur trade regained some order, French influence expanded into the interior through forts stretching from the Great Lakes to Louisiana. France dreamed of a giant arc of territory running from the St. Lawrence down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. In their minds, this elegant curve would dominate the continent and keep the British colonies confined to the Atlantic coast where they could sip tea and behave. The British, of course, had their own dreams. Their population in North America was booming. While New France had just a few tens of thousands of settlers, the British colonies had nearly 1 million people by mid-century. They were spreading westward, clearing forests, building farms, and acting as if land was infinitely available. This difference in population alone was a warning sign. France had ambition, but Britain had numbers. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, spilled into North America as Queen Anne's War. Fighting in North America was scattered, messy, and full of raids launched from both sides. When the war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, France took a significant hit. It ceded Newfoundland, Acadia, except Cape Breton, and Hudson Bay to Britain. France still held the St. Lawrence Valley, but it had lost crucial territory. The British now controlled areas that could threaten French shipping routes and settlements. France tried to counter this by building the massive fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Louisbourg was designed to be impregnable, the kind of fort that made British officers lose sleep and ask for more cannons. It guarded the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and was crucial to France's fishing and trade operations. But even the strongest fortress can't fix everything. New France still had a tiny population, limited resources, and constant pressure from British settlement creeping closer every year. All the while, indigenous nations were navigating this tightening conflict with impressive skill. The Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, Mohawk, Anishinaabe, and many others balanced alliances with both empires to protect their lands and autonomy. Neither France nor Britain controlled their allies, despite what European maps pretended. Indigenous diplomacy continued shaping events as deeply as imperial strategies did. By the 1740s, Europe started another round of fighting because apparently it was a tradition by this point, and the War of the Austrian Succession, aka King George's War in North America, erupted. Louisbourg became a target. In 1745, British colonial forces from New England, backed by the Royal Navy, captured it after a siege that surprised even them. France got Louisbourg back in the peace settlement, but the writing was on the wall. This rivalry was only growing hotter. Then came the big one, the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. If the previous wars were skirmishes, this one was a full continental clash. It began officially in 1756, though tensions had been rising for years. Both France and Britain wanted control of the Ohio Valley. France claimed the territory through exploration routes and alliances. Britain claimed it because land-hungry colonists wanted it, and British investors smelled profit. In 1754, a young George Washington, still years away from becoming the first US president, stumbled into history by leading a skirmish that helped ignite the conflict. The war escalated quickly. French forts spanned the interior. British forces pushed from the east. Indigenous nations took sides or tried to stay neutral, though neutrality became increasingly difficult as the fighting grew. At first, France performed well. Its alliances with indigenous nations gave it strategic advantage. Its troops were skilled in woodland warfare, and its commanders, like Montcalm, were talented. But two problems loomed. First, France was fighting a global war, stretching its resources thin across Europe, Asia, and the Atlantic. Second, the British population in North America dwarfed that of New France. Britain could throw far more soldiers into the fight, and it did. By the late 1750s, Britain launched major offensives. They captured Louisbourg again in 1758. They secured territory in the interior, they built momentum, and in 1759 they set their sights on Quebec, the heart of New France. What followed is one of the most famous battles in Canadian history, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. It is remembered as a dramatic showdown between two commanders, General James Wolfe for Britain and the Marquis de Montcalm for France. Both men were ambitious, both were determined, neither would survive the battle. Wolfe pulled off an unexpected maneuver. Under cover of darkness, his troops scaled a cliff west of Quebec City and positioned themselves on the plateau, waiting for dawn. Montcalm, realizing the threat, led his forces out from the city walls. The battlefield was open, uneven, and tense. The French troops, many of them militia or indigenous allies unfamiliar with European line combat, faced disciplined British soldiers trained for exactly this kind of engagement. The battle lasted only about 15 minutes. Wolfe was shot 3 times and died on the field. Montcalm was mortally wounded and died the next day. The French lines broke. Quebec fell to the British. New France was not yet fully lost, but the tide had turned. In 1760, Montreal surrendered. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. France ceded almost all its North American territories to Britain, keeping only a few small islands for fishing rights. Just like that, 2 centuries of French imperial ambition in Canada were over. But the end of French rule was not the end of French identity. Thousands of French settlers, now called Canadians, remained. They had farms, families, communities, and a culture deeply rooted in the St. Lawrence Valley. Britain suddenly found itself governing a large French-speaking Catholic population that had no interest in becoming English. To avoid rebellion, Britain introduced the Quebec Act of 1774. This act allowed Canadians to keep French civil law, maintain Catholic institutions, and preserve many of their traditions. It was a pragmatic move. Britain understood that peace was easier when people didn't hate their rulers. But this accommodation would later irritate the American colonists to the south, who saw the Quebec Act as Britain favouring French Catholics over English-speaking Protestants. It became one of the grievances fueling the American Revolution. Canada, without even asking for it, found itself pulled into another global conflict simply by being in the neighbourhood. For Indigenous peoples, the shift from French to British control was not just a change of flags, it was a transformation of power dynamics. France had relied heavily on Indigenous alliances. Britain, with its larger population and different political goals, had less incentive for equal partnership. Some Indigenous nations welcomed the British. Others worried, correctly, that Britain's hunger for settlement would threaten their lands. The balance that had shaped the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence regions for generations was unraveling. Still, the end of New France was not the tidy collapse it appears on paper. French culture endured, the fur trade continued. Indigenous nations remained central players. British administrators struggled to govern a diverse population, and the continent's future was far from settled. This chapter is about loss, but also about transition. France stepped out, but the people of New France stayed. Britain stepped in, confident as ever, but walked straight into a century of challenges they never anticipated. And Indigenous nations continued navigating shifting alliances with determination and resilience. Canada was changing hands, but its story was far from over. By the time the 1770s rolled in, Britain was sitting on a large chunk of North America it had won from France just a decade earlier. You might think that after all the expensive imperial drama, Britain would take a moment to relax, breathe, maybe enjoy a cup of tea without incident. But no, Britain immediately found itself dealing with a different problem altogether. 13 colonies to the south that were becoming increasingly cranky about taxes, representation, and the general feeling that their supposed mother country was acting like a slightly overbearing landlord. The American Revolution was not Canada's rebellion, but it would reshape Canadian history anyway. It would send thousands of people north, it would redraw borders, it would shift alliances, it would even contribute to the shaping of modern Quebec identity. And it would mark the moment when Canada looked at the revolutionary fervour next door and, in a national tone that remains iconic to this day, quietly said, "We're good, thanks." To understand why Britain suddenly found its empire on fire, Picture the 13 colonies in the early 1770s. They were growing fast. They had busy ports, farms, merchants, newspapers, and a population approaching 2.5 million people. They were confident, they were diverse, and they were increasingly irritated that decisions affecting their daily lives were being made by people across the ocean who had never set foot in their towns. It was a recipe for trouble. Britain, still recovering from the 7 Years' War, tried to raise revenue by taxing the colonies. The colonists objected. Britain tried again. The colonists objected louder. Britain passed laws limiting self-governance. The colonists threw tea in harbours, printed angry pamphlets, and held town meetings that would one day be mythologized as the height of political courage. The situation spiraled. By 1775, war broke out. Now, what does this have to do with Canada? Plenty. For one thing, the British military presence in North America was now split. Troops stationed in Quebec and Nova Scotia were suddenly much more valuable. The British desperately needed a loyal northern base to fight from. At the same time, the revolutionaries looked north and thought maybe we should invite the Canadians to join us. That plan didn't go well. The revolutionaries sent letters to the Canadians offering freedom, unity, and liberty in the confident tone of people who assume everyone shares their enthusiasm. The Canadians, who had only recently adjusted to living under British rule after more than a century of French administration, were unconvinced. And the Quebec Act of 1774 played a huge role in their decision. The Quebec Act was Britain's attempt to keep the peace after taking over New France. It extended Quebec's boundaries, protected Catholic rights, allowed French civil law, and kept many local customs intact. The act was practical from Britain's perspective and a symbolic relief for French-speaking Catholics worried about assimilation. But south of the border, the act set off alarm bells. To the revolutionaries, it looked like Britain was rewarding Catholics and restricting Protestant expansion. To the Canadians, it looked like stability. So when the American rebels showed up offering freedom from Britain, most Canadians politely declined. They were not eager to trade one empire for another, especially when the new option seemed to be shouting a lot about liberty while not offering any concrete advantages. Still, the revolutionaries tried. In 1775, they launched an invasion of Quebec. Two American generals, Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, led the charge. Their plan was bold. If they could take Quebec, the entire province might join the revolution. They marched north through freezing weather, rugged terrain, and more logistical misery than anyone should endure willingly. Montgomery captured Montreal with relatively little resistance. Arnold marched through the wilderness of Maine in a nightmare trek that later became legendary for all the wrong reasons: starvation, sickness, and endless mountains. They met outside the walls of Quebec City in December, just in time for winter to reach its full icy glory. The Americans attacked. The British defenders, commanded by Governor Guy Carleton, fought back. The battle was chaotic. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded, and the American forces retreated, leaving Quebec firmly in British hands. The invasion fizzled over the following months. Disease spread through the American camps. Supplies ran low. The Canadians, far from rising up in support, watched the unfolding chaos with a general sense of absolutely not. By May 1776, the Americans withdrew, and the dream of bringing Quebec into the Revolution evaporated. Meanwhile, the war to the south raged on, and as the conflict intensified, thousands of people found themselves facing a painful decision. Not everyone in the 13 colonies supported independence. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain for reasons ranging from political belief to economic interest, to simply preferring not to overthrow their government in the middle of their busy farming schedule. These people were known as loyalists, and the revolution turned their lives upside down. Loyalists were harassed, threatened, attacked, and in many cases forced to abandon their homes. Towns split, families divided, neighbors turned on one another. It was not the tidy, noble rebellion that later mythology sometimes paints. It was messy and personal, and when the war ended with American victory in 1783, tens of thousands of Loyalists fled north to British territory. This mass migration changed Canada forever. About 30,000 Loyalists made their way to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and what is now Ontario. They brought with them farming tools, books, memories of the conflict, and a firm desire never to be ruled by rebellious Republicans again. Some were wealthy merchants, others were poor farmers. Many were black Loyalists, enslaved or free people who had been promised liberty by the British in exchange for supporting their cause. Their stories were complex, often heartbreaking, and critical to understanding the foundations of black Canadian communities. The arrival of Loyalists put enormous pressure on existing settlements. Nova Scotia, which included modern-day New Brunswick at the time, suddenly doubled in population. The influx caused arguments, overcrowding, and demands for better political organisation. In 1784, the British government divided Nova Scotia to create the new colony of New Brunswick, partly to give the Loyalists their own administrative space. New towns sprouted, new roads were cut through the wilderness, Loyalist refugees became founders of entire communities. Meanwhile, in Quebec, the arrival of English-speaking Loyalists posed a different kind of challenge. Quebec had been almost entirely French-speaking. Now thousands of Anglophones were demanding English laws, English schools, and a government that made sense to them. The Canadians, understandably, wanted to keep their own system. Britain found itself trying to mediate between two groups who shared very little beyond a dislike of being told what to do by outsiders. To manage the tension, Britain passed the Constitutional Act of 1791. This split Quebec into two colonies, Lower Canada, which was mostly French-speaking and followed French civil law, and Upper Canada, mostly English-speaking and following British law. Montreal and Quebec City remained the centres of Lower Canada. Upper Canada began developing along the Great Lakes, where Loyalists founded towns that would later grow into major Ontario cities. This division was not perfect. It created new political arguments instead of solving all the old ones, but it established a structure that shaped Canadian development for decades. French-speaking Canadians retained their culture, language, and religious rights, something that would have been less likely under direct assimilation policies. English-speaking settlers gained the familiar British institutions they wanted, and the British Empire avoided the immediate threat of rebellion. Indigenous nations, meanwhile, were dealing with their own shifting world. Many had sided with the British during the Revolution, believing, often correctly, that a British presence provided a stronger buffer against American expansion. After the war, however, Britain made peace with the United States in the Treaty of Paris without consulting its indigenous allies. The treaty drew borders across indigenous lands as if they were empty. For many communities, this felt like betrayal. The consequences would unfold in later decades, particularly in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Still, the post-revolution years marked a turning point. Canada was no longer just a cluster of scattered colonies reacting to European conflicts. It was slowly forming its own identity, one shaped by French roots, British institutions, indigenous partnerships and struggles, and the influx of Loyalist refugees who had chosen Crown over Republic. And perhaps the most Canadian detail of all is this. In the face of a dramatic revolution unfolding next door, Canada remained calm, kept its head down, chose stability over rebellion, and went on building farms, trading furs, drafting laws, and occasionally glancing south with the general vibe of, "We hope you're okay, but we're not doing that." The American Revolution didn't create Canada, but it shaped the conditions that would allow Canada to emerge. It brought new populations, new borders, and new political frameworks. It also set up the next era, When the young United States would keep eyeing its northern neighbor, Britain would still be a major presence, and Canada would continue inching toward becoming something distinct. If the American Revolution was Canada's polite refusal to join the drama next door, then the War of 1812 was the moment when Canada got dragged onto the stage anyway, armed with muskets, militias, and a deep sense of, we really don't want to be part of this, but here we are. It was messy, loud, full of misunderstandings, and ended in such a way that both sides immediately wrote memoirs insisting they won. It was also one of the defining events in early Canadian history, the moment when Canadian identity, still just a fragile outline, got a few solid strokes added to it. To understand this war, you need to rewind to the early 19th century, when Britain and the United States were not exactly getting along. Britain was busy fighting Napoleon in Europe, which meant its navy was stretched thin, stressed out, and prone to stopping American ships at sea, grabbing sailors, and drafting them into service. Impressment, as it was called, was Britain's way of saying, "We're at war and you look seaworthy." The Americans, understandably, were furious. Add to this a series of trade restrictions Britain imposed while battling France. These restrictions interfered with American commerce, annoyed American merchants, and made the United States feel as if it was being treated like an accidental side character in someone else's drama. By 1812, American frustration had reached boiling point. Congress declared war on Britain. Now imagine being Canada in this moment. Canada did not declare war. Canada did not want a war. Canada was simply part of the British Empire, quietly farming, trading, and trying to recover from the sudden arrival of thousands of loyalists a generation earlier. But geography doesn't care about comfort. If the Americans were fighting Britain, they were inevitably going to look north, because that's where British territory sat. Long, thin, and sparsely defended. The Americans believed conquering Canada would be easy. They expected settlers to welcome them. They expected British defences to crumble. They expected Indigenous allies to melt away. They expected the war to last about 5 minutes. None of that happened. Let's begin with the Canadian side. Upper Canada, modern Ontario, and Lower Canada, modern Quebec, had small populations, limited military resources, and vast land to defend. But they had several key advantages: motivated militias, strong alliances with Indigenous nations, skilled officers, and the simple fact that when someone invades your home, you tend to fight harder. One of the first major events came at Fort Detroit. American General William Hull marched into Upper Canada, delivered an intimidating proclamation about liberty and freedom, and expected locals to rise up. They did not. Instead, British General Isaac Brock teamed up with Shawnee leader Tecumseh, one of the most extraordinary Indigenous figures in North American history, and together they pulled off one of the cleverest psychological victories of the war. Brock and Tecumseh marched their forces back and forth through the woods in a loop to make it appear they had far more troops than they actually did. Tecumseh's warriors added their own tactics to amplify the impression. When Brock demanded Hull's surrender, Hull looked at the growing lines, panicked, and handed Detroit over without a single major battle. It was a humiliating moment for the Americans and a stunning morale boost for the British, Canadians, and Indigenous allies. Brock became a hero, Tecumseh became legendary. But Brock's triumph was short-lived. Later that year, at Queenston Heights, he was killed while leading a counterattack against another American invasion. His leadership had been crucial, and his death was a heavy blow. But the militia and British regulars held the line, and the Americans were pushed back again. As the war continued, battles spread across the entire border. Some were large and decisive, others were small, chaotic, and so badly coordinated they barely made sense even at the time. Campaigns shifted between Upper Canada, the Niagara frontier, the St. Lawrence River, and the Great Lakes region. Indigenous nations played a decisive role. Tecumseh, in particular, was fighting not just for Britain but for the vision of a united Indigenous Confederation that could resist American expansion. His leadership was strategic, disciplined, and deeply respected. American officers feared him, British officers admired him, Canadian militiamen considered him essential to their survival. His alliance with the British was rooted in mutual interest, not subservience. Britain needed Indigenous allies to defend their thinly populated colony. Indigenous nations needed Britain not because they trusted the empire blindly, but because the United States was aggressively pushing westward, threatening their homelands. Tecumseh believed that a British victory might preserve Indigenous autonomy. It was a desperate hope, but it was also the only viable option at the time. Then came the Battle of Moraviantown in 1813, also known as the Battle of the Thames. During a retreat, British leadership faltered. Tecumseh and his warriors stood their ground while British troops fell back. The American forces overwhelmed them. Tecumseh was killed in the fighting. His death marked not just a turning point in the war, but a devastating moment in Indigenous history. His dream of a united Indigenous Confederation died with him. The balance of power across the Great Lakes shifted permanently. Meanwhile, naval battles erupted across the lakes. If you think lakes are peaceful, you have clearly never looked into the naval history of Lake Erie. In 1813, American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, whose name sounds like he stepped out of a comic book, led a fleet of ships in a major battle. The British lost. Perry famously declared, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," and the Americans gained control of the lake. This forced the British to adjust strategies and retreat from key positions. But even with American gains, the war did not unfold the way they hoped. Every time they tried to conquer Upper Canada, local militias fought fiercely. Every time they tried to take Lower Canada, the French-speaking Canadians defended their homeland with surprising determination. The Americans had assumed they would be welcomed. Instead, they found themselves outmaneuvered in terrain they didn't understand, against opponents who had learned the land over generations. One dramatic moment came in 1813 at a small homestead near Queenston. Laura Secord, a Canadian woman living in occupied territory, overheard American officers planning a surprise attack. She set out, on foot, through swamps and forests to warn British and Indigenous forces. She walked roughly 30 kilometers, climbing over fences, dodging patrols, and trudging through terrain that would make a seasoned hiker reconsider life choices. Thanks to her warning, British and Mohawk forces ambushed the Americans and captured them. Today, Laura Secord is remembered as one of the war's most iconic figures. Ironically, many people know her name from a chocolate company named in her honor, not from the fact that she essentially saved an entire region from invasion. Back in Washington, the war was not going well for the Americans, who were spending money, losing battles, and dealing with political infighting. Britain, for its part, was busy defeating Napoleon in Europe and suddenly had fresh troops and ships to send overseas. Things escalated quickly. In 1814, British forces marched into Washington, D.C. and burned several buildings, including the White House. This was retaliation for earlier American attacks in Upper Canada, including the burning of York, modern Toronto. The British weren't trying to conquer the United States, they simply wanted to make a point. The point was made, loudly, in flames. Yet even with these dramatic moments, neither side gained clear advantage. The United States fought fiercely on its own soil, Canada defended its territory, Indigenous nations fought for survival, Britain balanced global priorities. The war dragged on until everyone was exhausted, broke, and increasingly confused about what they were fighting for. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in late 1814, ended the war. It restored pre-war boundaries, no territory changed hands, no grand victories were won, no lasting concessions were made. The only thing truly resolved was that both sides agreed to stop fighting. And yet the aftermath tells a different story. The United States claimed it had secured its sovereignty against British meddling. Britain claimed it had successfully defended Canada. Canada, still decades away from being its own country, came out of the conflict with a newfound sense of identity. The war had forced English-speaking loyalists, French-speaking Canadians, British troops and Indigenous warriors to defend the same territory. They hadn't always agreed, they didn't all fight for the same reasons, but together they had kept the border intact. For Canadians, the War of 1812 became a story of resilience, surprising victories, and the famous moment where a small, scattered population held off a much larger neighbour. For the Americans, the war became a story of proving their young republic could stand up to the world's biggest empire. Both sides built national mythologies around the same events, which is an impressive display of historical multitasking. For Indigenous nations, however, the war's legacy was far more painful. Tecumseh's death and Britain's post-war disengagement left many communities vulnerable to American expansion. Promises made by British officials during the war were quietly forgotten afterward. Indigenous lands were increasingly encroached upon, and the balance of power shifted heavily toward the United States. This part of the story is often left out of patriotic celebrations, but it remains central to understanding the true cost of the conflict. Still in Canada, the war became a foundational moment. Upper and Lower Canada held together, borders stabilized, communities rebuilt. And the idea of a distinct Canadian identity, something separate from both France and the United States, began to take shape. The war did not create Canada, but it strengthened the early sense that this region was not simply an extension of someone else's empire. It was a place people would fight for. If the early fur trade was a lively chaos of canoe brigades, alliances, and small forts that doubled as diplomatic meeting halls, the next era takes that chaos and hands it over to something far more dramatic: a corporate empire. And not just any corporation. The Hudson's Bay Company, established in 1670, grew into such a massive force that it effectively controlled a third of the continent. Picture a single company claiming everything that drains into Hudson Bay, millions of square kilometers, and doing it with complete confidence. It was the kind of audacity only Europeans with royal charters could muster. To understand how this came to be, you need to go back to two French traders with a rebellious streak, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers. These two men had the kind of energy you only get from people who refuse to follow rules, prefer adventure to obedience, and have strong opinions about how fur trading should be run. After years of exploring the interior, they became convinced that bypassing the entire French system by sailing directly into Hudson Bay would open an enormous new trade route. The French authorities, in a predictable show of bureaucratic confidence, disagreed. Annoyed, Radisson and de Groseilliers did what every frustrated employee dreams of. They went to the competition. They defected to England, pitched their idea to the English aristocracy, secured a ship, and sailed into Hudson Bay to prove their point. When they returned with a ship full of furs, the English were thrilled, the French were horrified, and the Hudson's Bay Company was born. Its charter signed by King Charles II, granting it trade rights to a territory so large no one had yet mapped it. From the start, the HBC ran on a deceptively simple business model. Instead of paddling deep into the continent to chase furs, they built forts along the shores of Hudson Bay and waited for indigenous traders to bring furs to them. This stay-by-the-bay method worked surprisingly well. Indigenous nations, particularly the Cree, brought furs to HBC posts like York Factory and Moose Factory, in exchange for metal tools, cloth, guns, beads, and other goods. The company grew steadily, confident it had found the perfect low-effort, high-profit system. But business never stays simple for long. The French weren't about to let the English enjoy a monopoly. Throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, French expeditions targeted HBC forts. Both sides captured and recaptured posts in a game of territorial tug-of-war that must have been exhausting for the people who actually lived and worked there. Eventually, after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the English secured official control over the Hudson Bay region, but competition with French traders in the interior only grew more intense. This competition sharpened dramatically with the rise of the Northwest Company in the late 1700s. The NWC was a collective of ambitious Montreal-based traders who refused to sit by any bay and wait politely for business. They paddled deep into the interior, establishing posts, traveling thousands of kilometers, and building relationships with indigenous nations that were often more flexible and personal than those of the HBC. If the Hudson's Bay Company was the conservative, aristocratic elder brother, the Northwest Company was the scrappy younger sibling with too much energy, too many ideas, and a 2-year canoe trip's worth of coffee in its system. Its partners were often Métis or French-Canadian voyageurs, men skilled in language, travel, diplomacy, and the kind of paddling endurance that defies modern imagination. The voyageurs became legendary figures, sinewy, sunburnt, singing as they paddled, carrying 2 90-pound packs across portages, because of course one wasn't dangerous enough. The competition between the two companies grew fierce. It wasn't just about money, it was about territory, influence, and prestige. The HBC clung to its coastal strategy, but began gradually pushing inland to counter the NWC's dominance. The NWC expanded west toward the Rockies, establishing posts that reached deep into indigenous lands. For decades, the two companies operated like parallel universes that frequently collided, sometimes cooperated, and often harassed each other so aggressively that historians today have to double-check some stories to confirm they're not over-dramatized fiction. Amid this corporate rivalry, Métis communities emerged as powerful forces in the prairies. The Métis were people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, often the children of French or Scottish traders and Indigenous women. But they were far more than a mixed background community. They forged their own language, Michif, their own culture, their own political traditions, and their own distinct identity. Their role in the economy, diplomacy, and governance of the prairies was enormous and often overlooked outside Canada's more honest history classrooms. The Métis became expert buffalo hunters, canoe builders, traders, interpreters, diplomats, and guides. They ran supply lines for the Northwest Company, organized hunting brigades, and held seasonal gatherings that were cultural powerhouses. Their influence spread across the Red River region, in what is now Manitoba, and much of Saskatchewan and Alberta. And because they sat at the crossroads of Indigenous and European worlds, they became indispensable to everyone until colonial governments later made the catastrophic mistake of trying to marginalize them. While the Métis grew in influence, the HBC and NWC rivalry reached absurd levels. Traders sabotaged each other's posts. Canoe brigades raced to reach certain locations first. They spied on each other, they spread rumors, they bribed Indigenous traders to choose their company over the other. At one point, the competition became so intense that both companies flooded remote regions with trading posts built so close together that you could literally walk between them in minutes. It was capitalism taken to an almost comedic extreme. But things truly spun out of control in the early 1800s, when the HBC backed the creation of the Red River Colony, led by Thomas Douglas, the Earl of Selkirk. Selkirk wanted to settle Scottish farmers who had been displaced by the Highland clearances. He saw the Red River Valley as a perfect place for them to rebuild their lives. The problem was that the valley was already home to Métis communities, Cree and Anishinaabe nations, and Northwest Company trade routes. Dropping a colony into the middle of that was like placing a British estate house in the center of an active airport runway. Tensions exploded. The Métis, led by gifted spokesman Cuthbert Grant, opposed the settlement because it threatened their hunting grounds, trade routes, and way of life. The Northwest Company opposed it because it threatened their business. The HBC supported it because they believed it would solidify their control over the region. Every group had something worth fighting for, and the situation escalated toward violence that no one would later describe as one of Canada's shining moments. The conflict reached its peak in 1816 at the Battle of Seven Oaks, where a confrontation between the settlers and Métis fighters turned deadly. Governor Robert Semple of the Red River Colony and 20 of his men were killed. It was a tragedy, but it was also a moment of Métis victory, proof that the people of the prairies would defend their rights and their homeland fiercely. By this point, British authorities realized the fur trade rivalry had spiraled into dangerous territory. Violence was spreading, profits were dropping, lawsuits were piling up, investors were panicking. The prairies were becoming a corporate battlefield, and the British government, still recovering from earlier wars and colonial crises, was not in the mood to manage two competing fur empires at each other's throats. So in 1821, the Crown forced the two companies to merge. The Hudson's Bay Company absorbed the Northwest Company, taking on its trade routes, forts, and employees. The merger created a single fur trade powerhouse with near total control over the Northwest. It was the end of an era of corporate rivalry, but the beginning of something even larger: the HBC as a continental empire. Under the merger, many Métis and French-Canadian employees continued working as voyageurs, traders, interpreters, and leaders, but power centralized in London and later in Winnipeg headquarters. Indigenous nations remained the backbone of the fur trade, skilled trappers, suppliers, and guides, but increasingly found their autonomy challenged by a company that now had no competitor to balance its authority. The merged HBC expanded westward, establishing posts that would eventually become the seeds of cities like Winnipeg, Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver. The company's influence spread across the Arctic and Pacific coast as well, bringing it into contact and conflict with the Russian, Spanish, and American interests along the northwest coast. By the mid-1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company controlled a vast territory with its own legal system, its own trading economy, and a network of posts that functioned as administrative centers. It was, in effect, a shadow government long before Canada had any dream of confederation. The company issued licenses, controlled who could trade, administered justice, or at least a version of it, and made decisions that affected tens of thousands of Indigenous, Métis, and settler lives. It sounds mythic, but it was also fragile. The fur trade was changing, animal populations were declining, global markets were shifting. The rise of agriculture, settlement, and new transportation technologies threatened the company's dominance. The era of canoes and fur brigades was slowly giving way to an era of surveyors, railways, and political negotiations. Yet during this period, roughly from the late 1600s to the mid-1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company shaped the entire northern half of the continent. They opened routes, built communities, formed alliances, and relied heavily on Indigenous and Métis knowledge. They made fortunes, they caused conflicts, they reshaped landscapes. Their legacies are woven into the founding of towns, provinces, and political systems. But while the fur trade had dominated Canada's story for centuries, it was about to be overshadowed by something even larger: the birth of a country. And the HBC, once the continent's most powerful corporate empire, would become the landlord selling off land to the brand new nation of Canada. By the mid-1800s, the giant fur trade empire that had once dominated the northern half of the continent was showing its age. Canoes were still important, indigenous nations still held deep political influence, and the Hudson's Bay Company still owned land that could swallow several European countries whole, but things were changing. Railways were on the horizon, population growth was accelerating, and political squabbles were piling up like laundry that no one felt motivated to fold. In short, British North America was becoming too complicated to run on improvisation alone. The colonies needed structure, they needed stability, and, most importantly, they needed a way to stop arguing about every small decision. Confederation wasn't some grand romantic moment where everyone lifted a maple leaf and burst into patriotic song. It was more like a long, slightly chaotic meeting in which everyone finally realized that working together would be easier than continuing to squabble. To understand why Confederation happened in 1867, picture the region before it existed. There wasn't one Canada. There were separate British colonies that often behaved like siblings forced to share a room. There was the province of Canada, an awkward political fusion of Upper and Lower Canada, modern Ontario, and Quebec, that Britain had mashed together in 1841 in an attempt to stop the constant rebellions and political meltdowns. There was Nova Scotia, there was New Brunswick, there was Prince Edward Island, there was Newfoundland, which observed the whole thing from a safe distance, like a neighbour watching a loud family argument from behind the curtains. And of course, the Hudson's Bay Company still controlled Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory, which were technically British but practically governed by a company ledger. The province of Canada was especially dysfunctional. The Act of Union in 1841 had merged the French-speaking Lower Canada and the English-speaking Upper Canada into one political unit. Britain, in all its confidence, believed this would create harmony. Instead, it created a political headache so persistent it could have been diagnosed as a national migraine. The new colony had two official sections, each with equal representation, even though Upper Canada's population eventually surpassed Lower Canada's. Laws had to gain majority support in both halves. Coalitions formed and collapsed with impressive frequency. Governments rose and fell faster than fashion trends. It was exhausting. Add to this the cultural tension between French-speaking Canadians who wanted to preserve their language, religion, and civil law, and English-speaking Protestants, many of whom wanted full assimilation. Political gridlock became constant. Members of the legislature spent so much time arguing that actual governance felt like an occasional hobby rather than a job. While Canada was busy disagreeing with itself, the United States was growing rapidly to the south. The American Civil War erupted in the 1860s, and the Union's military strength made British North America nervous. Britain was officially neutral, but its textile industry relied on southern cotton, and Confederate diplomats floated through London trying to charm politicians. The Union government noticed. At one point, tensions grew so severe that war between Britain and the United States seemed alarmingly possible. If war had erupted, British North America would have been caught in the middle, under-defended, under-organized, and in no shape to fight a powerful neighbor. Fear is a remarkable motivator. Suddenly uniting the colonies didn't sound like a tedious, bureaucratic task. It sounded like a survival strategy. Then came trade. The Reciprocity Treaty between British North America and the United States had allowed free trade in certain goods since the 1850s. Things went well until 1865, when the Americans, annoyed with Britain's behavior during the Civil War, refused to renew it. The end of free trade hit the colonies hard. They needed new markets, they needed internal trade, they needed something resembling cooperation. Even the railway situation was a mess. Rail lines existed, but they didn't connect in ways that made sense. Getting goods from Montreal to Halifax required complicated detours. Winter sealed off shipping routes. The maritime colonies worried about economic isolation. The province of Canada worried about being too big to manage yet too small to compete. Everyone complained, everyone blamed everyone else. The railway crisis alone could have sparked Confederation out of sheer frustration. Amid this backdrop of fear, economics and confusion, a handful of political leaders began to talk seriously about uniting the colonies. These were the fathers of Confederation, though it might be more accurate to call them the men who finally sat down long enough to agree on something. The most notable among them was Sir John A. Macdonald, a Scottish-born lawyer with sharp political instincts, a fondness for whiskey, and the uncanny ability to charm people into going along with ideas they had resisted for years. Macdonald didn't work alone. Georges-Étienne Cartier, a powerful French-Canadian politician, argued strongly that French-speaking Canadians needed protection that only a larger political union could provide. George Brown, a reformer from Upper Canada who had spent years arguing with Macdonald, shocked everyone, possibly even himself, by agreeing to cooperate. And in the Maritimes, Charles Tupper of Nova Scotia championed the idea as a solution to economic stagnation. The first serious meeting happened almost by accident. The maritime colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, had arranged a conference in Charlottetown in 1864 to discuss forming their own smaller union. The leaders from the province of Canada crashed the meeting like ambitious wedding guests who heard the food was excellent and the company might be negotiable. Luckily for everyone, the PEI organizers were in a good mood and liked parties. They let the Canadian delegation in. Charlottetown was lively. Delegates attended meetings during the day and banquets at night. Fancy dinners, boat rides, dances, and endless rounds of socializing created a surprisingly pleasant environment for discussing the future of British North America. The Canadians pitched their vision, a federation linking all the colonies into a single dominion, strong enough to stand on its own and flexible enough to maintain regional identities. The maritime delegates were intrigued, though skeptical. Prince Edward Island, in particular, looked at the idea with level-headed suspicion, as if someone had just offered them an extremely large horse and asked them to keep it in their backyard. More negotiations followed in Quebec City and London. Delegates debated constitutional structures, taxation, provincial rights, minority protections, and the delicate matter of balancing French and English populations. The debates were intense, but something unusual happened. The leaders didn't give up. They compromised. They crafted what would become the British North America Act, a document outlining a federal system where provinces retained significant authority while the central government handled national issues. One of the most important achievements of Confederation was the protection of French civil law and cultural rights in Quebec. Cartier and other French-Canadian leaders fought tirelessly to ensure their people would not be drowned out in an English-majority union. The structure they negotiated, dual legal systems, provincial control over education, and strong protections for language and religion, became foundational to Canada's identity. On July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born, made up of 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Macdonald became the new nation's first Prime Minister. Cartier became one of its principal architects. Brown, despite his long history of feuding with Macdonald, helped build a federation far stronger than the broken structure it replaced. It wasn't perfect. Confederation never is. Nova Scotia was deeply divided about the Union, and anti-Confederation politicians gained traction almost immediately. Prince Edward Island refused to join until 1873, preferring to observe from afar like a cautious shopper reading reviews before buying a large appliance. Newfoundland didn't join until 1949. The prairies weren't part of the initial deal. Indigenous nations were not invited to the negotiations at all, an omission that would shape generations of political conflict and injustice. But despite its flaws, Confederation provided a workable framework. It created a government capable of negotiating with the Hudson's Bay Company for Rupert's Land. It created a structure capable of building a transcontinental railway. It allowed Canada to grow, expand, and develop a political identity distinct from Britain and the United States. It gave French and English Canadians a system for coexistence, even if that system was occasionally held together with determination, compromise, and well-timed refreshments. In many ways, Canada did not come into being with fireworks or a sudden burst of national pride. It emerged because people were tired of dysfunction, tired of danger, tired of arguing, and ready to try something new. Confederation was the political equivalent of a group project where everyone finally agrees to stop fighting over the introduction and just write the thing. And it worked. The Dominion of Canada was born not through revolution or conquest, but through negotiation, through meetings, through dinners and debates, through frustration and compromise, through the understanding that unity, however imperfect, was better than endless conflict. The newly created country was small, stitched together by hope and optimism, with enormous land around it and an uncertain future ahead. But it had begun. And what followed would transform the nation completely. Western expansion, the purchase of Rupert's Land, the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and the arrival of settlers whose presence would forever reshape the prairies. When Canada became a country in 1867, it wasn't exactly a heavyweight. It was 4 provinces stitched together along the St. Lawrence and the Atlantic coast, sitting beside a vast stretch of land that looked enormous on a map, but belonged almost entirely to the Hudson's Bay Company. If the Dominion of Canada wanted to survive, it couldn't stay small. It needed space, stability, and something resembling a spine. What it had instead was a tiny population of vast wilderness and an American neighbor that occasionally eyed the prairies the way a hungry person eyes a freshly baked pie. This is the story of how Canada expanded westward, connected itself with rails, brought in waves of settlers, and stumbled through some of the hardest, most complicated moments in its history. It is a story of ambition, conflict, broken promises, resistance, resilience, and a railway that cost more money, sweat, and political headaches than anyone predicted. The first step in the Western expansion was dealing with the Hudson's Bay Company. The HBC still controlled Rupert's Land, a territory so large it made European monarchs pause and reconsider their career choices. Canada wanted that land, the United States wanted to expand northward, Britain wanted to be done managing companies pretending to be governments. And so in 1869, Canada negotiated the purchase of Rupert's Land for £300,000, a price that historians still argue over. It was either an extraordinary bargain or a continental clearance sale. Unfortunately, there was a glaring problem. No one consulted the people who lived there. Rupert's Land was home to diverse indigenous nations, Cree, Anishinaabe, Diné, Nakota, Dakota, and many others, as well as the Métis, whose communities spanned the prairies and whose cultural identity had flourished around the Red River region for generations. These weren't empty lands waiting for settlement. They were vibrant, organized societies with political traditions, trade networks, seasonal cycles, and deep knowledge of the land. When Canada announced it was taking over, the Métis were not impressed. They knew what it meant when distant governments made decisions without local input. They also knew that Canadian surveyors were already showing up, drawing grid lines that ignored existing farms and settlements, and generally behaving like people who had skipped the chapter explaining that entire communities already lived there. At the center of Métis resistance stood Louis Riel, a multilingual, educated, charismatic leader born at Red River. Riel understood both European political structures and Métis cultural traditions. When Canadian representatives began acting as if they owned the region before the ink on the purchase agreement had even dried, Riel stepped forward to organize resistance. In late 1869, the Métis took control of Upper Fort Garry in modern Winnipeg, formed a provisional government, and demanded negotiation rather than unilateral takeover. Riel wasn't staging a rebellion. He was insisting on basic political respect. The Métis drafted a list of rights, including language protection, land security, and fair representation, and sent it east. Canada, shocked that people might object to being governed without consent, hesitated. Negotiations were clumsy and slow. There were misunderstandings, mistrust, and moments of pure political chest-puffing. Matters took a darker turn when a group of Canadians opposed to Riel's government attempted an uprising and were arrested. Among them was Thomas Scott, a man who managed to be so disruptive, aggressive, and insulting that Riel's council eventually executed him after a chaotic trial. This execution electrified Canada. In Ontario, many English-speaking Protestants were furious. In Quebec, many French-speaking Catholics supported Riel's demands for cultural rights. The nation's linguistic divide flared instantly, foreshadowing a century of political tension. Despite the controversy, the provisional government achieved something remarkable. In 1870, the Canadian government and the Métis negotiated the Manitoba Act, creating the province of Manitoba, the postage stamp province, with guarantees for Métis land rights, French language protections, and religious freedoms. It was a landmark moment. It also would be undermined almost immediately. As Canadian surveyors poured into the new province, Métis land rights were mishandled, delayed, ignored, or misallocated in ways that ranged from careless to outright discriminatory. Many Métis families left Manitoba, pushed westward into Saskatchewan and Alberta in search of space free from bureaucratic intrusion. This growing displacement set the stage for conflicts to come. Meanwhile, Canada's ambitions stretched even farther. British Columbia agreed to join Confederation in 1871 on one condition: Canada must build a railway connecting the Pacific coast to the rest of the country. A railway across the Rockies sounded like something an optimist proposes before someone else presents the engineering reality. But Canada agreed, partly because it needed British Columbia, and partly because it feared that if it said no, the United States would happily say yes. Sir John A. Macdonald, back in office after a brief political scandal, threw his energy into the plan. The Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, would cross mountains, plains, rivers, forests, and enough difficult terrain to fill several volumes of cautionary advice for infrastructure planners. It would also cost staggering amounts of money, lead to more political scandals, and rely heavily on the labor of thousands of workers, including many Chinese laborers who were paid less, treated worse, and faced more dangerous conditions than other crews. Before construction could even begin, the prairies needed to be secured for settlement. This meant treaties. Between 1871 and 1877, Canada negotiated the numbered treaties with Indigenous nations from the Great Lakes to the Rockies. On paper, these treaties promised reserves, continued hunting rights, annual payments, tools, education, and support in times of famine. In reality, Canada saw them as legal clearance for settlement. Indigenous leaders saw them as solemn agreements rooted in sacred tradition, meant to ensure mutual support and coexistence. The problem wasn't the idea of the treaties, it was Canada's interpretation. Government officials often negotiated in bad faith, rushed through translations, broke promises almost immediately, and enforced policies that stripped Indigenous nations of autonomy while failing to deliver basic commitments. This betrayal laid the foundation for generations of hardship, injustice, and resistance. As treaty lands opened to settlement, immigrant farmers from Europe poured into the prairies. Ukrainian, Mennonite, Icelandic, Scottish, English, German, and Norwegian families arrived with hopes of building new lives. They brought farming tools, seeds, livestock, and determination. They also arrived on land indigenous nations had been pressured into giving up under unfair conditions. It was a complicated mixture of opportunity and loss, growth and displacement, resilience and sorrow. Amid this transformation, the Métis found themselves squeezed again. They had moved west to escape the chaos in Manitoba, rebuilding their communities along the Saskatchewan River. Their hunting, trading, farming, and cultural traditions continued, but pressures mounted. Bison herds were collapsing due to overhunting by American hunters. Settlers in the region called for more surveyors and more land titles. The Canadian government largely ignored Métis petitions for recognition and rights. Tension rose steadily. By the early 1880s, farms across the prairies were expanding, telegraph lines were snapping into place, and the CPR was consuming money like a starving giant. In 1885, facing near bankruptcy, the government pushed the railway through with massive loans and last-minute heroics. When the final spike was hammered into the track at Craigellachie, British Columbia, in November of that year, the transcontinental dream was realized. It was a triumph. It was a miracle. It was also built on tremendous cost, human, financial, and environmental. Before the railway was finished, however, tensions in the West reached a breaking point. Métis leaders, frustrated by government neglect, asked Louis Riel to return from exile in the United States and lead their cause again. Riel, who had spent years wrestling with personal, spiritual, and political turmoil, agreed. He issued petitions, called conventions, and tried once again to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Canadian officials ignored him. What followed became the Northwest Resistance of 1885. Métis fighters, joined by some Cree and Assiniboine warriors frustrated by starvation and broken promises, clashed with Canadian forces. Battles erupted at Duck Lake, Fish Creek, and Batoche. The CPR, barely completed across parts of the prairies, was used to move troops quickly, a devastating demonstration of how railways could strengthen state power. Despite strategic brilliance from Métis leaders like Gabriel Dumont, the resistance was overwhelmed. Riel surrendered. Several Cree warriors, including Big Bear's and Poundmaker's followers, were arrested. Riel was put on trial in Regina. His lawyers argued he was mentally unwell. Riel insisted he knew exactly what he was doing. The jury recommended mercy. The government ignored the recommendation. Riel was executed on November 16, 1885. Quebec erupted in grief and outrage. English Canada largely supported the execution. The divide deepened. The political scars remain visible today. Riel's death became a defining tragedy, one that still shapes Canadian identity, Métis history, and the national conversation about justice and reconciliation. After 1885, the prairies changed rapidly. Settlers poured in, towns grew, fields of wheat stretched to the horizon. Indigenous nations were confined to reserves, their movement restricted, their economies devastated, their children increasingly targeted by residential school policies that aimed to erase their cultures. It was a dark chapter at the heart of Canada's nation building, a legacy that the country is still reckoning with. Yet amid injustice, Indigenous nations held their cultures, languages, and political traditions alive. Métis communities rebuilt, newcomer farmers established lasting settlements. Railways connected people across immense distances. Winnipeg boomed. Calgary and Edmonton grew from tiny outposts into thriving towns. Vancouver rose from the ashes of forest clearings into a major Pacific port. Canada was becoming something vast and complicated, a nation with beauty and trauma intertwined. The march west was driven by ambition, but it came with consequences Canada could not hide from. The treaties were supposed to be agreements of coexistence. Too often they became tools of dispossession. The railway united the country. It also enabled policies that harmed Indigenous communities. Settlement brought prosperity for many. It brought loss and hardship for others. Still, this was the era when Canada became more than a narrow strip along the St. Lawrence. It became a continental nation, bound together by steel rails, waves of immigration, prairie winds, and the conflicting dreams of the people who lived there. By the late 19th century, Canada had stretched itself across a continent. The Canadian Pacific Railway had tied the coast together like a steel lifeline. Immigrants were arriving in waves. Indigenous nations were resisting, adapting, and enduring in the face of devastating federal policies. The prairies were filling with farms, towns, and telegraph poles, and Canada, having built the skeleton of a nation, now needed muscles, lungs, and a beating heart. In other words, industry, cities, and people. Lots of people. Industrialization in Canada didn't appear overnight like a magician pulling a factory out of a hat. It emerged slowly, unevenly, and with a rhythm that depended heavily on geography. Montreal, Toronto, and Hamilton became early manufacturing hubs. The Maritimes developed shipbuilding industries. British Columbia's economy boomed with fishing, lumber, and mining. The prairies were busy becoming the world's next great wheat basket. Each region had its own tempo, its own challenges, its own "we're busy" energy. Let's start with Montreal, which had been a major hub since the fur trade, but transformed dramatically in the late 1800s. Its strategic spot on the St. Lawrence River made it perfect for factories, shipping, and finance. Cotton mills spun textiles, foundries poured molten metal for locomotives, breweries multiplied, banks sprouted along St. James Street, which soon became the financial capital of the country. French and English communities lived side by side, sharing streets and splitting politics. Money flowed, and so did ambition. Montreal wasn't just a Canadian metropolis, it was an international player. Toronto, meanwhile, was rising fast. For much of the early 19th century, Toronto had been more polite than powerful, a place for newspapers, law offices, and government buildings. But the railway changed everything. Goods rolled in and out, factories sprung up, immigrants filled new neighborhoods. The city expanded outward in every direction like a teenager who suddenly needed a bigger pair of shoes every 6 months. Toronto took pride in being orderly, clean, productive, and just a tad bit smug about all of it. Hamilton, tucked at the western edge of Lake Ontario, leaned into its destiny as the industrial heartbeat of the nation. Steel mills dominated the skyline. Smoke from foundries curled above the city like a permanent weather system. Workers streamed in from across Canada and beyond, ready to build rail cars, machinery, and the physical infrastructure of a growing nation. Hamilton earned the nickname the Birmingham of Canada. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Out on the west coast, Vancouver grew at astonishing speed. What had been a modest logging settlement exploded into a city after the CPR chose it as the Pacific terminus. Within years, the region transformed into a bustling port. Lumber, salmon, coal, immigrants, and dreams came and went daily. Vancouver absorbed influences from Asia, Europe, and across Canada, becoming one of the most diverse cities in the country. It grew with a kind of restless energy that never really stopped. And then there was Winnipeg, the gateway to the west, a city that rose so fast it seemed on the verge of launching itself into the sky. With the railway running through its core, Winnipeg became a major commercial hub. Grain flooded in from prairie farms, flour mills roared, banks multiplied, immigrant neighborhoods blossomed. For a time, Winnipeg was one of the fastest-growing cities in North America, convinced it was destined to become another Chicago. All these cities reflected a deeper shift. Canada was becoming urban. In 1871, most Canadians lived in the countryside. By the early 20th century, the numbers had flipped. People moved to cities for factory work, for opportunity, for escape from small-town monotony, or simply because cities were where the future seemed to live. Immigration fueled this growth. The Canadian government, eager to populate the prairies and support industrial labour, launched aggressive campaigns to attract newcomers. Posters in Europe and the United States showed golden wheat fields stretching into forever. They promised fertile land, fresh starts, and the kind of prosperity that only governments with very creative marketing departments can promise with a straight face. Millions arrived. Ukrainians brought traditions, songs, and the skill to transform cold prairie soil into thriving farms. Italians, Greeks, and Portuguese built neighborhoods in cities. Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution found new homes and built community institutions. Chinese workers, who had built the most dangerous sections of the CPR, remained despite crushing discrimination and head taxes designed to keep them out. Black settlers from the United States moved north in search of refuge from Jim Crow laws. Sikh and Hindu immigrants arrived on the west coast, where they were welcomed by the land but not by federal legislation. Canada was becoming diverse, vibrant, and full of contradictions. New communities added depth and color to the national fabric. Yet racism and exclusion were built into many policies. The Chinese head tax, the Komagata Maru incident in 1914, and immigration restrictions targeting non-European groups revealed the darker side of a nation that was still learning how to live up to its ideals. While cities boomed, the countryside evolved too. Prairie farmers battled droughts, grasshoppers, harsh winters, and unpredictable markets. But their wheat fed not just Canada, but much of the world. As more land was cultivated, more settlers arrived. Grain elevators rose like wooden skyscrapers across the plains, symbols of the region's new agricultural dominance. But all this growth, urban and rural, came at a devastating cost to Indigenous peoples. The treaties, which were supposed to ensure shared stewardship and support, were repeatedly broken. Federal policies enforced reserve confinement, restricted movement, outlawed cultural practices, and introduced the residential school system, a system designed to eradicate Indigenous languages, identities, and communities. Children were taken from their families, often by force. Many suffered abuse. Many never returned home. This is part of Canada's industrialization too. It is impossible to separate the nation's economic rise from the policies that harmed Indigenous nations. While factories roared and cities glittered with possibility, Indigenous communities were fighting for survival against systems designed to erase them. The cities were not built on empty land. They were built on promises broken and treaties ignored. Yet Indigenous nations held on. They adapted. They protected languages, stories, and traditions. Leaders challenged federal policies in court and on the ground. Communities rebuilt despite staggering obstacles. The resilience that had carried them through centuries of change did not fade, it strengthened. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Canada's political landscape shifted too. The federal government took on new responsibilities: national banking, postal service expansion, tariffs, transportation planning, and the earliest hints of social policy. Labor movements emerged as factory workers demanded fair wages, safer conditions, and reasonable working hours. Newspapers multiplied, giving every political faction a voice and every city a reason to argue with its neighbor. Technology was transforming daily life. Electricity arrived in cities, illuminating streets and powering factories. Telephones linked towns. Streetcars rattled along rails. Automobiles appeared, thrilling some and terrifying horses everywhere. The nation began to move faster. Culturally, Canada was discovering a voice, writers, painters, musicians, and thinkers began defining what it meant to live in this enormous, cold, contradictory place. Lucy Maud Montgomery published Anne of Green Gables in 1908, putting Prince Edward Island on the global literary map. This was the age of the group of 7 painters who portrayed Canada's landscapes with emotion and bold colour, shaping national identity in oil and canvas. Sports also took on a bigger role. Hockey, once a scrappy pastime played on frozen ponds, became a source of local pride, regional rivalry, and eventually national obsession. Leagues formed, arenas filled, fans discovered the joy of shouting at referees. Hockey would become woven into Canadian culture in a way no one in the 19th century could have predicted. Politically, debates raged over tariffs, education, language rights, and provincial autonomy. French and English Canadians continued navigating their uneasy partnership. The West demanded more influence. The Maritimes worried about economic decline. And through it all, Canada grew. Messy, ambitious, stubborn, and determined. By the early 20th century, Canada had transformed from a string of colonial outposts into a complex, industrializing nation. It had factories humming, cities rising, railways connecting oceans, farms stretching across the prairies, ports bustling on both coasts, and immigration shaping its social landscape daily. But while Canada was achieving unprecedented growth, a storm was brewing on the horizon, one that would test the entire world. The first global conflict loomed, and Canada was about to step onto the international stage in a way it never had before. If industrialization pushed Canada into the modern world, the World Wars shoved it onto the global stage, whether it felt ready or not. Before 1914, Canada was a growing dominion with new railways, booming cities, prairie farms stretching to the horizon, and a long list of political debates that kept Parliament well caffeinated. After the wars, Canada emerged changed, more confident, more independent, and far more aware that distance from Europe did not mean distance from global conflict. The First World War began in 1914 with a diplomatic chain reaction so fast and so convoluted that historians sometimes need diagrams to keep track of who declared war on whom. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, Canada was automatically involved as part of the British Empire. Canada didn't hold a vote. It didn't issue a statement. It simply went to war because Britain did. But once the call was made, Canadians enlisted in massive numbers. Some joined out of patriotism, others for adventure, others because economic opportunities were limited at home. Indigenous men enlisted despite a government that denied them basic political rights. Black volunteers faced discrimination, but persisted. Immigrants from across Europe joined, many proud to defend the new country they now called home. Canada raised the first contingent, over 30,000 men, so quickly that Britain was genuinely impressed. For a country barely out of its adolescence, Canada moved with surprising decisiveness. The soldiers trained at Valcartier in Quebec before heading overseas. They arrived in England expecting a quick road to battle. What they received instead was months of training on muddy fields under cold skies, learning how to fight in a kind of warfare no one had witnessed before. Trenches. Long lines of mud, blood, and misery carved into the earth across France and Belgium. Machine guns rattled day and night. Artillery thundered constantly. Poison gas drifted across no man's land. Barbed wire turned fields into iron webs. Nothing about the Western Front resembled the romantic heroism young soldiers had imagined. Canadians entered battle in 1915 at Ypres, where German forces unleashed chlorine gas. It rolled across the lines, burning lungs and blinding soldiers. The Canadians, with no gas masks, used urine-soaked cloths as makeshift filters, one of those horrifying solutions that shouldn't work, but did, at least well enough to keep them alive. They held the line when other units broke. Ypres became a grim badge of courage, proof that Canadian troops could endure the unendurable. Next came the Somme in 1916, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The Canadians fought at Courcelette, advancing across churned earth under machine gun fire. Their efforts earned praise, but at a staggering cost in lives. The war was becoming a grinder of youth, hope, and possibility. Then in April 1917 came Vimy Ridge. Vimy is one of the most iconic names in Canadian history. It was not the largest battle of the war nor the most strategically decisive, but it was the first time all 4 Canadian divisions fought together as a single army. They trained meticulously. They mapped the battlefield so thoroughly that even privates knew more about the terrain than some officers in earlier battles. When the assault began on Easter Monday, Canadian troops climbed the ridge under snow and sleet, advancing through enemy lines with a precision that stunned observers. Within 3 days, the ridge was in Canadian hands. The victory became a national symbol, proof that Canada could stand on its own, shoulder to shoulder with major powers. After Vimy, soldiers and civilians alike began saying something quietly revolutionary, that Canada wasn't just a colony anymore, it was a nation. But pride came with pain. More than 10,000 Canadians were killed or wounded at Vimy. Across the entire war, over 60,000 Canadian soldiers died. Entire towns lost their young men. Families waited for letters that never arrived. The war stretched on until November 11, 1918, when the armistice was signed. The fighting ended, but the grief did not. When soldiers returned home, they found a country both grateful and unprepared. Veterans struggled to find work. Indigenous veterans returned to reserves where they still could not vote. The economy grew and faltered in uneven waves, but Canada's global standing had changed. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Canada received its own seat, separate from Britain. It signed the Treaty of Versailles as its own entity. The League of Nations recognized Canada as a distinct voice. Independence wasn't complete, but the door was open. The 1920s brought growth, jazz, and optimism. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, crushing wheat prices on the prairies, joblessness, and widespread hardship. Canada staggered through the decade, bruised but determined. Then, in 1939, war in Europe ignited again. This time, something important had changed. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd, Canada did not automatically follow. A week later, after its own parliamentary debate, Canada declared war independently on September 10th. The symbolism was powerful. Canada was no longer dragged into conflict by imperial obligation. It made its own decision. Once again, Canadians enlisted in droves. But this war looked different from the beginning. Technology had evolved, tanks rumbled, aircraft swarmed, radios crackled. Machine guns were faster, bombs were larger, civilians were increasingly drawn into the conflict as targets and workers. And Canada's role expanded beyond simply sending troops. In the early years, Canada trained airmen through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, one of the largest air training programs in history. Pilots from around the Commonwealth learned to fly on Canadian fields, in Canadian skies, under Canadian instructors. It was a monumental contribution, even if it unfolded far from the front lines. Canadian ships escorted convoys across the Atlantic, dodging German U-boats. Canada's navy, tiny in 1939, grew into one of the largest in the world by war's end. Factories in Ontario and Quebec shifted to wartime production. Tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food poured toward Europe. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers, changing social structures. Newspaper photos captured women in coveralls, welding goggles, and factory roles, once reserved for men. After the war, many would refuse to return quietly to old norms. But Canada's contribution was not limited to supporting roles. It fought in major theatres. In December 1941, Canadian troops stationed in Hong Kong were attacked by Japanese forces. The battle was brutal. The defenders were overwhelmed. Survivors spent years in harsh POW camps. It was one of the darkest chapters of the war for Canada. In 1943, Canadians stormed beaches in Sicily and Italy, slogging up the Italian peninsula in heat, mud, and mountainous terrain. Casualties were heavy, but the Canadians earned a reputation for toughness and determination. Then came Normandy. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Canadian forces landed at Juno Beach. The fighting was fierce. The surf was red with the costs of ambition and necessity. But by day's end, the Canadians had pushed farther inland than almost any other Allied force. They continued into France, fighting through the Channel ports, slogging through the Scheldt estuary in Belgium in a campaign so muddy, miserable, and strategically vital that even hardened soldiers still talked about it with awe and exhaustion decades later. As Canadian troops moved through the Netherlands, they helped liberate entire cities and towns. Dutch families still honor the memory of Canadian soldiers with gratitude that spans generations. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 40,000 Canadians had died. Yet even as the nation celebrated victory, it faced uncomfortable truths. Canada had interned more than 20,000 Japanese Canadians during the war, forcing families from their homes, seizing their property, and incarcerating them in camps despite no evidence of disloyalty. Many never recovered their losses. This is one of the clearest examples of how fear, racial prejudice, and wartime panic can strip rights from innocent people. Decades later, the Canadian government issued a formal apology and compensation, but the trauma remains part of the national conscience. After 1945, Canada changed again. The war had strengthened its industries, expanded its diplomatic presence, and shifted its internal politics. It emerged onto the world stage, not as a colony, not as an extension of Britain, but as a country with its own voice. Canada helped found the United Nations. It participated in NATO. It became known for peacekeeping, thanks in part to Lester B. Pearson, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for helping avert a global crisis during the Suez Affair. Veterans returned home to a country working to build a welfare state. Unemployment insurance, family allowances, healthcare foundations, and pension programs took shape. The country grew more confident, more modern, and more intertwined with global systems. The world wars had pulled Canada forward faster than anyone could have predicted. They had also left scars. Families mourned. Communities held empty chairs at dinner tables. Indigenous veterans returned to a country that still denied them basic rights. Japanese Canadians spent years rebuilding lives destroyed by government policy. Black Canadians who had enlisted with pride came home to the same discrimination they had faced before. Still, Canada's sense of itself had changed. The wars pushed the country to grow up fast. They revealed strengths Canadians didn't know they had. They exposed weaknesses the nation could no longer ignore. They set the stage for new political movements, new social conversations, and a new sense of what Canada could become. By the late 1940s, Canada was standing at a threshold. No longer a young dominion waiting for cues from elsewhere, but a nation preparing to define its future. And in the decades that followed, it would face challenges and transformations that reshaped identity, politics, culture, and the very meaning of being Canadian. By the mid-20th century, Canada stood tall in the afterglow of the Second World War. Industrially stronger, internationally respected, and increasingly confident. Cities buzzed with growth, suburbs spread like someone had spilled a bucket of houses and decided they looked fine where they landed. New Canadians arrived in waves, carrying languages, food traditions, and hopes that would reshape the social landscape. For a moment, the country felt stable, even predictable. Then the ground shifted under everyone's feet. The next decades would see the rise of Quebec nationalism, the explosive Quiet Revolution, the first major Indigenous rights movements, and a federal government trying to modernize itself while holding together a country that seemed determined to test every seam. The Constitution itself became the center of a political tug-of-war, intense enough to make even the calmest Canadian reach for a stronger cup of tea. Let's start with Quebec. For generations, French-speaking Quebec had lived with a sense of tension, rooted in language, culture, and the long shadow of the conquest in 1763. French Canadians had survived waves of political change, assimilation pressures, and economic inequality. But by the 1950s, Quebec remained a largely rural, clerical, conservative society. The Roman Catholic Church dominated education, healthcare, and social life. Maurice Duplessis, Quebec's premier for 2 decades, treated dissent like a noisy neighbor he could silence with legal threats and a stern glare. Then in 1959, Duplessis died, and Quebec changed almost overnight. The 1960s brought La Révolution Tranquille, the quiet revolution, which was quiet only in the sense that no one fired muskets. Everything else moved at lightning speed. Quebec modernized its education system, it secularized institutions, it built state-run corporations like Hydro-Québec, asserting control over resources historically dominated by English-speaking business elites. French Canadians began calling themselves Québécois, a word charged with pride and political meaning. With modernization came a surge of nationalism. Many Québécois felt that Canadian federalism left them culturally overshadowed and economically disadvantaged. If Canada was a partnership, they argued, it wasn't a fair one. The idea of sovereignty, that Quebec could or should become independent, moved from fringe debate to household discussion. Some expressed nationalism through politics, others through activism, a small minority through violence. The FLQ, Front de Libération du Québec, a radical separatist group, carried out bombings, robberies, and eventually kidnappings. In 1970, they abducted British diplomat James Cross and Quebec cabinet minister Pierre Laporte. Laporte was killed. It was a shocking, grief-stricken moment. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau responded by invoking the War Measures Act, the first and only time it was used in peacetime. Troops patrolled Montreal. Hundreds were arrested without charge. Canadians were stunned. Some applauded the firm hand, others saw it as an overreach. But the crisis underscored something unmistakable. Quebec nationalism was not going away. While Quebec grappled with identity, Indigenous peoples across Canada were pushing back against a century of oppressive policies. By the 1960s, the federal government had built reserves under tight control, enforced the residential school system, and used the Indian Act to restrict movement, governance, and traditional practices. But Indigenous nations refused to be erased. The 1969 White Paper, proposed by Trudeau's government, attempted to abolish the Indian Act altogether. It framed this as equality, arguing that Indigenous peoples should be treated like all other Canadians. But Indigenous leaders saw the real intent: dismantling treaty rights, ignoring sovereignty, and continuing assimilation by stealth. They organized fiercely. Harold Cardinal, a Cree leader, wrote The Unjust Society, a scathing response. Chiefs, elders, activists, and youth united to reject the White Paper so completely that the government withdrew it. This resistance marked a turning point. Indigenous political movements grew stronger. Organizations like the National Indian Brotherhood, now the Assembly of First Nations, built national leadership networks. Court cases challenged land rights restrictions. Young activists revived languages, cultural practices, and political pride. Indigenous women fought discriminatory laws that stripped them of status if they married non-status men. It was a new era of resilience, visible, determined, and unignorable. Meanwhile, the rest of Canada was transforming too. The immigration reforms of the late 1960s removed discriminatory quotas, opening the door to newcomers from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the Middle East. Canada's population became more diverse than ever. Toronto shifted from a largely British Protestant city to one of the most multicultural in the world. Vancouver's demographic landscape transformed. Montreal embraced global immigration even as it wrestled with its own national identity. For a country that prided itself on politeness, Canada found itself turning into a place where nearly everyone was different from nearly everyone else. A multicultural mosaic emerged, messy, vibrant, occasionally frustrating, and fundamentally Canadian. But beneath the cultural transformation lay a political question that refused to fade. What exactly was the Canadian Constitution? Until the early 1980s, Canada did not fully control its own constitution. To amend it, the federal government still had to go through Britain. This was embarrassing enough for a country that had been independent in almost every other way for decades. Pierre Trudeau made patriation, the transfer of the Constitution from British to Canadian control, his mission. Patriating the Constitution wouldn't just mean bringing it home. Trudeau also wanted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms embedded in it, protections for equality, free expression, legal rights, mobility rights, and more. A modern constitutional Bill of Rights that would apply across the country. It sounded simple. It was anything but. The provinces had opinions, many, loud ones. They were determined to protect their autonomy. Quebec wanted recognition as a distinct society. Western provinces wanted to control resources. The Atlantic provinces demanded protections. Everyone wanted something, and almost no one trusted Trudeau's centralizing instincts. Negotiations dragged on, tempers flared. Legal experts argued so intensely that several probably contemplated new careers involving fewer conference rooms. Quebec Premier René Lévesque, a charismatic champion of sovereignty, rejected Trudeau's plan. Other premiers waffled. Then came the Kitchen Accord of 1981, named because a small group of federal and provincial officials ironed out a compromise in a hotel kitchen after a long night of negotiation. 11 provinces eventually agreed. Quebec did not. The Constitution Act of 1982 became law without Quebec's formal consent, and the wound remains politically sensitive. But despite the controversy, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms became a cornerstone of Canadian identity. It empowered citizens, redefined civil rights, and reshaped court decisions for decades to come. If the Quiet Revolution reshaped Quebec, the Charter reshaped the country. Through the 1970s and 80s, another shift unfolded quietly but profoundly: recognition of Indigenous rights in the Constitution. Section 35 affirmed existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, opening the door for future court victories and political negotiation. It was not a solution, far from it, but it was a legal foothold Indigenous nations used to push back against centuries of imposed control. Meanwhile, economic changes swept across the nation. Factories closed in some regions and opened in others. Oil discoveries in Alberta turned the province into an energy powerhouse, fueling both prosperity and tension about federal policies. Toronto overtook Montreal as Canada's financial capital, partly due to political uncertainty in Quebec, partly due to global economic flows. These shifts deepened regional divides, west against east, Quebec against Ottawa, urban against rural. Canada didn't break, but it strained, stretched, and argued with a passion that would surprise anyone who still believes Canadians never raise their voices. Yet despite constant disagreements, something interesting held Canada together. The idea that conflict was not a failure, but part of the national conversation. Something Canadians negotiated, debated, and occasionally compromised on. This messy, ongoing dialogue became one of the country's defining features. The decades after the Second World War were not peaceful. They were turbulent, transformative, alive. Quebec found a new political voice. Indigenous nations built powerful movements. The federal government redefined itself. Immigration changed the social fabric. Rights were expanded. Debates sharpened. Canada found itself wrestling with identity, belonging, and the question of who truly holds power in a diverse, complex country. And yet, by the end of the 20th century, Canada emerged with a constitution it controlled, a charter that reshaped society, a Quebec still passionately debating its future, and Indigenous nations steadily reclaiming political space they had long been denied. It wasn't tidy, it wasn't simple, but it was Canada, changing, arguing, growing, and learning what it meant to share a country with people whose histories stretched in every direction. By the time Canada stepped into the last decades of the 20th century, it had built railways across mountains, sent soldiers across oceans, survived depressions, fought constitutional battles, endured referendum drama, and adopted a charter that reshaped daily life. You'd think the country might take a breath, maybe settle into a comfortable chair, maybe drink something warm and take a nap like a satisfied cat. But Canada, as always, moved forward with the mix of optimism, arguments, contradictions, and resilience that had become its unofficial national personality. The late 20th century and early 21st century were not eras of quiet. They were years of debate, transformation, heartbreak, pride, and the ongoing project of figuring out how to live together in a country so vast that weather systems can vary by entire seasons in a single afternoon. This chapter brings the story into the present, where Canada continues to be shaped not just by history, but by the people who carry it. We begin with Quebec. After the Quiet Revolution and the constitutional battles of the 1980s, the question of Quebec's status remained intensely alive. In 1980, Quebec held its first referendum on sovereignty association, a proposal for political independence paired with economic partnership with Canada. Premier René Lévesque led the movement with intelligence, conviction, and trademark chain-smoking intensity. The referendum was passionate, the turnout huge. The result? About 60% voted no. Separatists were disappointed, but determined. Canada breathed out, slowly. Then came the Meech Lake Accord in 1987, an attempt to bring Quebec formally into the constitutional family by recognizing it as a distinct society and giving provinces more autonomy. It collapsed dramatically in 1990 when Manitoba and Newfoundland failed to ratify it. The agreement's failure sparked deep frustration in Quebec and energized the sovereignty movement. In 1995, a second referendum asked whether Quebec should become an independent country. The vote was razor-thin, so close that the country held its breath until the last counted ballot. The final result? 50.6% voted no. Canada remained intact by a margin smaller than the seating capacity of some hockey arenas. It was a turning point that left scars and relief in equal measure. But as Quebec debated its future, Indigenous peoples across Canada were fighting for theirs. The late 20th century saw the rise of powerful Indigenous rights movements, fueled by legal victories, activism, and the relentless work of communities determined to break through generations of colonial policy. The 1990 Ochre crisis became one of the most defining moments in modern history. When plans to expand a golf course near the Mohawk community of Kanesatake threatened sacred burial ground, community members erected barricades. What followed was a 78-day standoff involving provincial police, the Canadian military, and Mohawk activists. It exposed deep-rooted racism, land disputes, and government failures that couldn't be ignored. The crisis shocked the country and forced Canada to confront the reality that Indigenous rights were not historical footnotes, they were living issues demanding justice. The 1990s brought more turning points. In 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed Métis hunting rights in R.V. Pauli. In 1999, the creation of Nunavut carved out a new territory governed largely by Inuit leadership, an unprecedented recognition of Indigenous political presence. While these milestones unfolded, Canada continued reshaping itself socially. The policy of multiculturalism, officially adopted in 1971, grew from a symbolic gesture into a defining national framework. Rather than expecting newcomers to melt into a single cultural mold, Canada embraced a mosaic approach, diversity as a strength, not a threat. Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, and Montreal transformed into some of the most multicultural urban centers in the world. Streets filled with languages, foods, clothing, and traditions from every continent. It didn't mean tensions vanished, it meant the country learned to expand rather than contract. Economic shifts also left their mark. The decline of resource industries in some regions hit hard, while western provinces, particularly Alberta, boomed thanks to oil. The discovery of the massive Athabasca oil sands turned Alberta into an economic powerhouse, fueling prosperity but also sparking national debates on environmental policy, resource ownership, and federal-provincial relations. In 1989, the Free Trade Agreement with the United States reshaped business. In 1994, it became NAFTA. Factories adjusted, jobs shifted, debates flared. It was a reminder that Canada's economy was always intertwined with global currents. The early 2000s brought a wave of new conversations. Same-sex marriage, once unthinkable in political circles, became legal nationwide in 2005, years before many other Western countries followed. The movement for LGBTQ2S+ rights grew steadily, propelled by activists and allies determined to shape a country that welcomed everyone. And then came one of the most significant moments in recent history. Canada formally apologized for the residential school system. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, was launched to gather survivors' testimonies, document abuses, and educate the country about a system that had stolen children, destroyed families, suppressed cultures, and caused trauma that carried across generations. The stories were heartbreaking, raw, impossible to forget. In 2015, the TRC delivered 94 calls to action, a roadmap for meaningful reconciliation. They addressed education, healthcare, child welfare, justice, language revitalization, and the need for national remembrance. Many of these calls remain incomplete, but they sparked a national conversation that continues today. The 21st century has also brought challenges that stretch the idea of national unity. Climate change threatens northern communities, forests, fisheries, and coastlines. Wildfires, floods, and extreme weather grow more intense every year. Conversations about oil pipelines, carbon emissions, and environmental responsibility have split regions and political parties. At the same time, the Arctic, long overlooked by southern Canadians, has become a focal point of geopolitical interest. Melting sea ice opens shipping routes, countries eye northern resources, and through all of it, Inuit rights and leadership remain central because for them, the Arctic is not a frontier, it is home. Immigration continues shaping the country in new ways. Newcomers bring innovation, revitalizing aging populations and expanding Canada's sense of itself. Cities grow denser, more complex, more vibrant. Housing affordability becomes a national headache. Rural regions worry about labor shortages. The conversation about belonging shifts constantly. Technology leaps ahead. Social media blurs political lines, new industries rise, old ones adapt. Canada, like the rest of the world, finds itself riding change it can't always control. Yet through all this noise, a few themes remain deeply Canadian. One is the ongoing work of reconciliation, confronting the truths of colonialism, honouring Indigenous knowledge, rebuilding relationships, and listening in ways the country has never done before. This work remains incomplete, but it grows each year through legal victories, language revitalization, youth advocacy, and community leadership. Another is the persistent balancing act between French and English Canada. Quebec nationalism didn't vanish after the 1995 referendum, it evolved. New generations debate identity in ways their parents never dreamed of. But they also shape music, literature, politics and art that enriches the entire country. A third theme is the ongoing definition of multiculturalism. What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to share land, stories, institutions, and responsibilities with people from everywhere? Canada's answer remains, it's complicated, but we're trying. And finally, there is the quiet truth that Canada's identity is not fixed. It grows, shifts, unravels, and rebuilds. It is shaped by Indigenous nations whose histories stretch back thousands of years, by French-speaking communities who kept culture alive despite incredible odds, by British institutions that left marks both positive and painful, by immigrants who arrived with little except hope, by generations born here who reinvent the country with each passing decade. Modern Canada is not perfect, it is not serene, but it is honest in its struggles, open to reinvention, and stubbornly committed to a future where more voices, not fewer, shape the story.